The stillness of the night in the affluent gated community was shattered by the deafening roar of a gunshot, a sound so jarring it seemed to ripple through the manicured lawns and pristine hedges. Like an unwelcome intruder, Officer John Parker stood rooted to the spot, his heart pounding in his chest like a war drum, the acrid scent of gunpowder stinging his nostrils as faint wisps of smoke curled from the barrel of his still-warm firearm. His hands trembled slightly, though he tightened his grip to steady them, unwilling to let the tremor betray the storm raging within him. Before him, sprawled across the perfectly trimmed grass, lay Michael Carter, a young black teenager whose life had just been snuffed out in an instant. A basketball, its slow roll away from Michael's outstretched fingers a haunting echo of the carefree moments he'd lived only seconds before, came to a stop near a flower bed. Beneath the boy's motionless form, a dark crimson pool spread steadily, the blood seeping into the earth, staining the idyllic scene with a brutal reality Parker couldn't unsee. For a fleeting moment, Parker was statue still, his mind a chaotic whirl of justification and denial. He looked suspicious, he repeated to himself, the words of fragile lifeline he clung to as his confidence wavered. He could have been a threat, but even as he tried to cement that thought, a gnawing doubt clawed at the edges of his resolve. Michael had been unarmed, his only weapon the basketball now lying abandoned in the grass. The realization hit Parker like a punch to the gut, but he shoved it down, refusing to let it take root. Not yet. His breath came in shallow, uneven gasps as the distant wail of sirens pierced the night, growing louder with every passing second. Porch lights blinked on one by one, casting long shadows across the street as curious neighbors pressed their faces to windows, drawn by the commotion like moths to a flame. Parker didn't hear the screech of tires at first, his focus locked on the scene before him. But the sharp sound jolted him back to reality. A sleek black SUV jerked to a stop just yards away, its door flying open with such force it seemed to carry the weight of a father's dread. Judge David Carter emerged, his tall frame silhouetted against the vehicle's headlights. At first, his face was a mask of confusion, his brow furrowed as he took in the flashing lights and the growing crowd. But then his gaze landed on Michael, his son, and the confusion melted into a visceral horror that twisted his features into something unrecognizable. "Michael," he cried, his voice raw and jagged, splitting the air as he broke into a desperate sprint toward the body. Instinct kicked in for Parker, and he stepped forward, throwing up a hand to block the grieving father's path. "Sir, you need to stay back," he said, his voice quivering despite his attempt to project authority. The words felt hollow, inadequate against the tidal wave of anguish bearing down on him. David's eyes blazed with a fury born of unimaginable loss. "That's my son," he roared, his voice breaking as he lunged forward, trying to shove past. Parker planted his feet, his hand twitching toward his holstered gun in a silent warning, though inside he was unraveling. He could feel the sweat beating on his forehead, the weight of his badge suddenly unbearable. The chaos drew the attention of other officers arriving on the scene, their radios crackling with urgency. Two of them moved in, hesitant but determined to diffuse the escalating tension. Sergeant Tim Murphy, a stocky man with a weathered face and a reputation for keeping his cool, stepped between Parker and David. "Judge Carter, we need you to calm down," he said, his tone firm but laced with an undercurrent of sympathy. "Let the paramedics do their job." David's head snapped toward him, his eyes glinting with icy rage. "Calm down," he spat, his voice trembling with a mix of grief and indignation. "That's my son lying there because of him." He jabbed a finger at Parker, who flinched as if struck, the accusation landing like a physical blow. Parker opened his mouth to defend himself, to cling to the narrative he'd constructed in his mind. But the words died in his throat. The sight of Michael's blood-soaked body, the undeniable truth of what he'd done, choked him into silence. As paramedics rushed forward, their movements brisk and mechanical, David broke free of the officer's restraint and stumbled to his son's side. He dropped to his knees, his hands hovering over Michael's still form, shaking as if afraid to touch him, afraid that doing so would make the nightmare real. When his fingers finally brushed Michael's cold skin, a guttural sob tore from his chest, low and broken. "Michael, no," he whispered, the words barely audible at first, then rising into a desperate, piercing wail. No, no. The sound sliced through the night, silencing the murmurs of the officers and the growing crowd of onlookers. Even Murphy, who'd seen his share of tragedy in his years on the force, paused, his usual stoicism faltering. Judge Carter, he began again, stepping closer. We need to secure the scene. Please, step back. David surged to his feet, whirling to face him with a fire in his eyes that could have burned the whole neighborhood to ash. Secure the scene, he hissed, his voice low and venomous, barely containing the fury boiling beneath it. You failed to secure my son's life, and now you want to sanitize this? He flung an arm toward the blood-streaked grass, his gesture wild and unrestrained. Is this your justice? The question hung in the air, heavy and accusing, as the crowd of neighbors pressed closer, their whispers growing into a restless hum. Some nodded in quiet agreement, their faces tight with anger, while others stood in stunned silence, clutching their robes tighter against the chill of the night. The flashing lights of additional squad cars and an ambulance painted the scene in stark reds and blues, amplifying the surreal horror unfolding before them. Murphy edged closer to Parker, his voice dropping to a hushed urgency. You need to step aside. John, this is bigger than you now. Parker's mind spun, a dizzying reel of images flashing before him, Michael turning toward him, hands raised in what he now realized was surrender, not threat, the split-second decision to pull the trigger, the way the boy's body had crumpled to the ground, the justification he'd clung to that Michael had seemed dangerous cracked and shattered under the weight of hindsight. I thought he had something, he stammered, his voice so faint it barely reached Murphy's ears. David overheard, though, and advanced on him with a predator's intensity. You thought, he snarled, his voice cutting like a blade. You thought my son was a threat because he was holding a basketball, or because he was black in this neighborhood. Judge Carter, Murphy interjected, stepping between them again, his tone sharper now. We'll let internal affairs handle this. David's laugh was a bitter, hollow sound that echoed off the houses around them. Internal affairs? The same system that puts men like him back on the streets after they murder unarmed kids? Don't insult me. The other officers exchanged uneasy glances, their hands resting on their belts, unsure how to proceed. Parker looked like a man on the verge of collapse, his knuckles white around the grip of his gun as if it could shield him from the consequences. Crashing down around him, the paramedics finished their grim work, zipping Michael's body into a black bag with a sound that seemed to reverberate in David's bones. As they lifted the stretcher, David watched, his fists clenched so tightly his nails dug into his palms. The sight broke something deep within him, and he staggered forward, his voice rising with each step. You'll pay for this, Parker, he vowed, his words dripping with a father's anguish and a judge's authority. I'll see you in court, and I swear you'll remember my son's name for the rest of your miserable life. Parker said nothing, his gaze locked on the ambulance as its doors slammed shut and it pulled away, its siren a mournful cry fading into the distance. The silence that followed was suffocating, broken only by the soft rustle of leaves and the murmurs of the crowd. David stood alone for a moment, staring at the blood-stained grass where his son had fallen, his shoulders heaving with the weight of a grief too vast to contain. When he spoke again, his voice was steady, resolute. This isn't over, he said, a promise etched into every syllable. With Michael's body gone and his anger simmering beneath his sorrow, David Carter made a silent vow he would hold Parker in the system. That had emboldened him accountable, no matter the cost. Earlier that day, Michael Carter had woken to the gentle hum of a typical morning. The sun streamed through his bedroom window, casting golden streaks across the robotics project he'd been tinkering with late into the night. A college freshman studying engineering, he'd spent the day in lectures, his mind buzzing with equations and designs. By afternoon, he was back home, hunched over his desk, tweaking circuits and dreaming of the future. But as evening approached, a restless energy took hold. He grabbed his basketball, the worn leather familiar in his hands, and shot a quick text to his friends, "Meet me at the court." For Michael, basketball wasn't about winning, it was about freedom. The rhythm of dribbling and shooting, a release from the pressures of school and the expectations weighing on him. Under the dim glow of the outdoor court's lights, he played with his usual fire, laughing as his friends traded jabs and playful insults. The game was winding down when Michael took a shot from the edge of the court, the ball arcing high before clanging off the rim and sailing over the tall fence, into the neighboring gated community. "Nice shot, genius," one of his friends teased, elbowing him with a grin. Michael chuckled, brushing off the ribbing. "Hold up, I'll grab it," he called, already jogging toward the fence. He didn't notice the faded private property sign tucked near the corner, nor did he think twice about it. To him, it was just a quick detour to retrieve his ball and get back to the game. With an easy grace, he scaled the fence, landing lightly on the other side. The grass was soft under his sneakers, the air thick with the scent of jasmine from nearby gardens. He spotted the ball a few yards away, nestled against a shrub, and scooped it up. Turning to head back, a light flicked on from a nearby house, and Michael froze, squinting toward the sudden brightness. A shadow moved behind the window, and the curtains snapped shut. Shrugging it off, he started toward the fence again, unaware that inside the house, Marjorie Dunham, a middle-aged woman with a pinched face and a habit of jumping to conclusions, was already on the phone with 911. "There's someone outside near the basketball court," she whispered, her voice tight with urgency. "He looks suspicious as wearing a hoodie, and he's black. I think he might be up to something." The dispatcher's calm response did little to ease her nerves, but she hung up satisfied that help was on the way. Meanwhile, Officer John Parker sat in his cruiser near a convenience store, the glow of his phone illuminating his face as he scrolled idly. The radio crackled to life, cutting through the boredom. "Unit 72, we have a report of a suspicious individual in the Greenfield Estates area near the basketball court. Caller reports possible trespassing." Parker straightened, his pulse quickening. 10-4, on my way, he replied, starting the engine with a flick of his wrist. As he drove toward the scene, his mind churned with familiar assumptions. Calls like this were routine, and in his 8 years on the force, they rarely ended with someone who was entirely innocent. His hand brushed his holster, a reflexive gesture as adrenaline sharpened his senses. When he pulled up to the entrance of the gated community, Parker stepped out, his boots crunching on the gravel. He scanned the area, his eyes narrowing as they landed on Michael walking back toward the fence, basketball in hand. "Hey, stop right there," he barked, his voice slicing through the quiet night like a whip. Michael jolted, startled by the command, his head whipping toward the source of the sound. In that moment, under the harsh glare of Parker's flashlight, the boy's fate was sealed not by who he was, but by what Parker assumed him to be. What followed was a tragedy born of prejudice and a split-second choice, a single act that rippled outward to engulf a family, a community, and a nation in its wake. For David Carter, it was the loss of his only son, a wound that would never heal, and a call to wield his power as a judge to demand justice not just for Michael, but for every life diminished by a system that too often shielded those who abused it. For Parker, it was the unraveling of his certainty, a haunting lesson in the consequences of unchecked authority and the fragility of the assumptions he'd built his career upon. And for the onlookers, neighbors, the officers, the friends left waiting at the court, it was a stark reminder that justice, when corrupted by power, could leave nothing but grief and reckoning in its wake. The evening air hung heavy and still, the faint hum of cicadas buzzing through the quiet suburban neighborhood. Michael dribbled his basketball absent-mindedly as he walked, the rhythmic thump against the pavement blending with his soft whistling. He'd lost track of time on the court, the sun dipping below the horizon, casting long shadows across the manicured lawns and pristine driveways. His ball had rolled off after a bad bounce, tumbling into the yard of a house just beyond the community court. He didn't think much of it, it was just a ball, just a quick retrieval. His sneakers scuffed the grass as he stepped forward, bending slightly to scoop it up. "Drop the ball and keep your hands where I can see them." The command sliced through the stillness like a blade, sharp and unyielding. Michael froze mid-motion, his fingers tightening instinctively round the worn leather of the basketball. His heart gave a sudden lurch, a jolt of confusion rippling through him as he straightened up slowly, turning to face the voice. Officer John Parker stood a few yards away, his posture rigid, one hand hovering near the holster at his hip. The sodium streetlights cast harsh shadows across his face, accentuating the hard lines of his jaw and the glint of suspicion in his narrowed eyes. "I'm just getting my ball," Michael said, his voice tinged with bewilderment but steady. "Cooperative." He tilted his head slightly, gesturing toward the court glowing faintly in the distance under the floodlights. "I'm heading back there now." His words hung in the air, simple and honest, but they seemed to crash against an invisible wall. Parker didn't flinch, didn't soften. Instead, he took a deliberate step closer, his boots thudding against the ground with purpose. "I didn't ask for an explanation," he snapped, his tone cutting deeper this time. "I said drop the ball." Michael's brow furrowed, a flicker of unease sparking in his chest. There was something in Parker's stance, the way his shoulders squared, the way his hand twitched near his gun that felt wrong, hostile. He swallowed hard, his throat dry, and nodded. All right," he muttered, his voice softer now, placating. Slowly, he bent his knees, lowering the ball to the grass with exaggerated care, as if any sudden move might shatter the fragile tension between them. The ball hit the ground with a dull thud and rolled a few inches away. Michael straightened up, raising his hands, palms out, fingers splayed. "See, I'm not doing anything wrong," he said, his eyes locking with Parker's, searching for some sign of reason. But Parker's mind was a storm, a chaotic swirl of adrenaline and warped perception. To him, Michael's hesitation wasn't compliance, it was defiance. The slow movements, the slight pause before dropping the ball, twisted in his head into something deliberate, threatening. His pulse pounded in his ears, drowning out the quiet logic that might have told him this was just a kid with a basketball. "What are you doing out here?" he demanded, his voice rising, his hand now clamping firmly onto the grip of his pistol. The metal felt cold and heavy against his palm, grounding him in the rush of authority coursing through his veins. "I told you," Michael replied, his tone firm but still measured, careful not to provoke. "I'm just getting my ball." He took a small, instinctive step back, his sneakers scuffing the grass again, needing space from the officer's looming presence. The air between them crackled with unspoken tension. "Don't move," Parker barked, yanking his gun from its holster in one fluid motion. The barrel gleamed under the streetlights as he leveled it at Michael's chest. Michael's breath caught in his throat, his hands trembling as they hovered in the air. His mind raced, a frantic reel of every warning his parents had ever given him spinning through his head. "Stay calm. Don't argue. Don't make sudden moves." He could hear his mother's voice, steady but urgent, drilling those lessons into him since he was old enough to understand why they mattered. "I'm not armed," he said, forcing the words out evenly, though his chest tightened with every syllable. "I'm not armed." Parker's gaze darted over Michael, fixating on the loose hoodie draped over his frame. The fabric shifted slightly in the evening breeze, and in Parker's adrenaline-fueled haze, it became something sinister, a hiding place for a weapon, a sign of danger. "You expect me to believe that?" he snarled, his voice dripping with accusation. "You've been sneaking around private property, and now you're playing innocent." Michael's fear hardened into frustration, a hot ember flaring in his gut. "Sneaking around?" he echoed, his pitch rising despite his efforts to stay calm. "I was getting my ball." "This is insane." The words slipped out before he could catch them, raw and unguarded, and he saw the shift in Parker's face instantly, his features tightening, his knuckles whitening around the gun. "I said don't move," Parker shouted again, his voice booming through the empty street. Michael opened his mouth to protest, "I'm not moving," but fear or instinct betrayed him. His body shifted, a half-step backward, barely perceptible, a desperate bid to reclaim some semblance of safety. To Parker, it was an act of rebellion, a spark igniting the powder keg of his paranoia. Without a word, without a second's hesitation, he pulled the trigger. The gunshot shattered the night, a deafening crack that reverberated off the neatly trimmed hedges and brick facades. Michael's eyes widened, a gasp escaping his lips as the bullet tore into him. His legs buckled, the force hurling him backward onto the dew-damp grass. Pain exploded through his chest, sharp and searing, stealing the breath from his lungs. He hit the ground hard, his vision swimming, the basketball lying abandoned a few feet away, rolling lazily toward the curb as if nothing had happened. Parker stood rooted to the spot, his gun still raised, the acrid scent of gunpowder stinging his nostrils. His chest heaved, his breath shallow and ragged, as the reality of what he'd done crashed over him like a tidal wave. His hands shook, the weight of the weapon suddenly unbearable, but he couldn't lower it, not yet. He stared at Michael's crumpled form, willing him to move, to groan, to prove this wasn't the end. But the boy lay still, a dark stain spreading beneath him, soaking into the earth. Inside her home, Marjorie Dunham flinched at the sound of the shot, her teacup clattering against its saucer. She'd called the police minutes earlier, her voice trembling as she reported a suspicious figure in her yard. She'd expected a stern warning, maybe a quick chase to scare him off at this. Her frail hands fumbled with the blinds, parting them just enough to peek outside. The sight stole the air from her lungs. Michelle sprawled on the lawn, motionless, the red pool beneath him glinting in the flashing lights of Parker's squad car. Her phone slipped from her grasp, hitting the hardwood floor with a dull thunk as she pressed a hand to her mouth. The dispatcher's voice buzzed faintly from the receiver, tinny and distant. "Ma'am, is the officer on the scene?" "Yes," she whispered, her voice cracking, barely audible over the pounding of her heart. He shot him." Her stomach twisted violently, bile rising in her throat. "What do you mean?" the dispatcher pressed. "Is the suspect still armed?" Marjorie's eyes fixed on the basketball, now resting against the curb, innocent and out of place. "No," she choked out, tears welling in her pale blue eyes. "He wasn't armed. He had a basketball." Outside, the neighborhood stirred awake. Windows glowed as curtains parted, faces peering cautiously into the night. The murmur of voices grew as neighbors trickled onto their porches, some clutching robes tighter against the chill, others fumbling with phones to capture the unfolding horror. Parker's radio crackled with static, backup requests cutting through the haze of his spiraling thoughts. He stepped back, the gun still in his hand, its barrel dipping slightly as his resolve faltered. "What did I just do?" The question clawed at him, relentless, but no answer came. Michael's blood gleamed darkly under the streetlights, a stark accusation pooling on the grass. The screech of tires tore through the chaos as a black SUV barreled down the street, skidding to a halt. The driver's door flew open, and Judge David Carter leapt out, his polished shoes striking the pavement with a force that matched the fury in his chest. His eyes swept the zenith flashing lights, the growing crowd, the officer with a gun, and then landed on the body. For a fleeting moment, disbelief clouded his sharp features, his mind refusing to process the sight. Then recognition hit, and horror flooded in its wake. "Michael," he roared, his voice raw and guttural, shoving past the onlookers who parted like water before a storm. Parker jolted, stepping forward instinctively to block him. "Sir, you can't. Don't you dare tell me what I can't do," David bellowed, his voice trembling with a rage so fierce it seemed to shake the air itself. His broad shoulders heaved, his fists clenched at his sides as he advanced, undeterred. Parker raised a hand, a feeble attempt at authority. "This is a crime scene. You need to step back." "A crime scene?" David's voice cracked like a whip, his eyes blazing as he towered over Parker. "You mean my son? That's my son lying there." His words echoed, heavy with anguish, silencing the murmurs of the crowd. Sergeant Tim Murphy arrived then, sprinting toward the confrontation, his face etched with urgency. "Judge Carter, please," he said, his tone measured but firm. "We understand." "You don't understand anything," David cut him off, his voice venomous, dripping with contempt. He pointed a trembling finger at Parker, whose face drained of color under the weight of that gaze. "That's my son, and he's dead because of that trigger-happy coward." Murphy placed a hand on David's shoulder, a gesture meant to calm, but David recoiled as if burned. "Calm down," he spat, his voice rising over the restless hum of the crowd. "My son is dead, and you want me to calm down?" His chest heaved, his breaths ragged, as he pushed past them both, dropping to his knees beside Michael's body. The sight of his son, his vibrant, laughing boy reduced to a lifeless shell, broke something deep inside him. His hands hovered over Michael's chest, trembling, afraid to touch the blood-soaked hoodie, afraid to make this nightmare real. "Michael," he whispered. The name a fragile prayer lost in the wind. The crowd grew louder, their shock morphing into anger. Phones glowed as videos rolled, capturing every tear, every shout. Parker stammered, his voice weak, barely audible. He was trespassing. I thought. You thought. David surged to his feet, whirling on Parker with a fury that could have leveled mountains. You thought what? That a basketball was a weapon, that his skin made him a threat. His voice thundered, shaking with grief and righteous indignation. The neighbors pressed closer, their murmurs swelling into a chorus of outrage. Judge Carter. Murphy interjected, stepping between them again. We're going to investigate this thoroughly. Investigate? David sneered, the word bitter on his tongue. You think I don't know how this goes? Internal affairs will bury this, like they always do. Not this time. Not with my son. His eyes burned with a promise, a vow carved in stone. Paramedics rushed in, their stretcher rattling as they approached Michael's body. David stepped back reluctantly, his gaze never wavering as they worked. The zipper of the body bag closed with a sound that pierced him. A guttural cry tore from his throat. Ron primal, silencing the crowd in its wake. They loaded Michael into the ambulance, and David followed, his steps heavy, deliberate. He paused at the rear doors, watching as his son disappeared inside, then turned to Parker. You'll pay for this, he said, his voice low, laced with a quiet, unyielding rage. The ambulance pulled away, sirens wailing, leaving behind a neighborhood forever altered. By morning, the footage had erupted across social media. Grainy videos of David's confrontation with Parker, looped endlessly on news broadcasts. Headlines screamed, unarmed black teen killed by police. Tragedy in gated community ignites outrage. Protesters flooded the streets, their numbers swelling from a handful to hundreds. Signs aloft, justice for Michael, stop killing our sons. At the police station, tension simmered as counter-protesters arrived, clutching signs defending Parker, shouting about law and order. Arguments flared, and officers formed a barricade to hold the line. In the crowd, Maya Carter, Michael's older sister, stood tall, her sign raised high. My brother deserved to live. Her eyes blazed with a fury born of loss, her voice cutting through the chaos as a man taunted her. Maybe if he wasn't trespassing, he'd still be alive, he jeered. Maya stepped forward, undaunted. He was getting his basketball. That's not a crime. Her friend tugged her back, whispering, it's not worth it. But the fire in Maya's gaze didn't dim. Inside his study, David watched the news unfold, his phone buzzing incessantly. Reports, colleagues, friends. He ignored them all, his mind locked on Michael's face. Helena Carter entered, her cheeks streaked with tears. David, she said softly, what are we going to do? He looked up, his expression hardening into steel. We're going to fight, he said. For Michael, for justice, for every family this system has crushed. Helena nodded, wiping her eyes. Promise you'll make them pay. He rose, his resolve unshakable. I promise. The lesson was clear, woven into every tear, every shout. Justice was not a given, it was a battle. And the abuse of power, the reckless swing of authority, left scars that rippled far beyond the moment of impact, demanding accountability that could never fully heal the wound. In a cramped, dimly lit room, Officer John Parker slumped forward, his head cradled in trembling hands. The air felt thick with despair, the faint hum of a flickering fluorescent bulb overhead amplifying his isolation. His uniform, once a symbol of authority, now clung to him like a heavy shroud. The door creaked open, and Captain Harris stormed in, his boots thudding against the worn linoleum floor. His face was a storm cloud, brows furrowed, lips pressed into a tight line, eyes blazing with barely contained fury. This isn't going anywhere, Parker, he said, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. Do you even realize who you just gunned down? Parker didn't lift his gaze. His fingers twitched, curling into the roots of his hair as if he could pull the truth out of his skull. I didn't know. He mumbled, the words barely audible, fragile as a dying breath. Harris loomed closer, his shadow swallowing the small space between them. Well, you do now. And the judge, he's coming for you with every ounce of firepower he's got. You'd better brace yourself. Parker's hands tightened into fists, knuckles whitening as guilt and panic churned in his gut. "It was an accident," he whispered, his voice cracking under the weight of his own defense. Harris's eyes narrowed, his tone sharp enough to slice through steel. "Accident or not, you've dragged this whole department into a firestorm. Get yourself a lawyer. Parker, you're gonna need one fast." That same night, David Carter stood on the cracked pavement outside his modest home, the cool evening breeze doing little to ease the heat of his grief. His broad shoulders sagged under an invisible burden as he watched the street fill with a swelling tide of protesters. Their signs bobbed like buoys in a restless sea. "Justice for Michael," scrawled in bold, angry letters. News vans lined the curb, their satellite dishes gleaming under the streetlights, while reporters shouted questions that pierced the air like arrows. David ignored them, his dark eyes locked on the growing crowd, their chants rising into a unified roar. He stepped forward, his work-worn hands trembling slightly as he raised one to hush the clamor. The voices stilled, and in that fragile silence, he spoke, his tone steady, but laced with raw resolve. "My son's life was stolen from him," he said, each word a stone dropped into still water. "But Michael's story doesn't end with his last breath. We're fighting for justice, and not just for him, but for every family this system has crushed and cast aside. This isn't just a cause, it's a movement, and it begins right here, right now." The crowd erupted, their cheers a thunderclap of shared pain and fury, their voices weaving into a single, unbreakable thread: justice for Michael, fueled by a father's anguish and a community's outrage. David Carter silently vowed to tear down the machinery that had allowed his son's death, a vow that would ignite a battle reaching far beyond the courtroom, into the very soul of a fractured society. In a shadowed conference room, David sat across from Amanda Green, the air between them crackling with unspoken tension. The faint glow of a desk lamp cast sharp angles across Amanda's face as she pored over a thick stack of documents, her sharp hazel eyes darting across each page with surgical precision. She was a force calm, calculated, her every movement deliberate. With a flick of her wrist, she slid a single sheet across the scratched wooden table toward David. "Officer Parker's got a history," she said, her voice cool but edged with steel. 12 complaints: excessive force, racial profiling, intimidation, all swept under the rug with internal reviews and insufficient evidence. David's jaw clenched as he scanned the paper, his fingers tightening around the edges until the sheet crinkled. 12 times, 12 warnings ignored, buried by a system too cowardly to act. Not one led to so much as a slap on the wrist, he growled, the anger simmering in his chest threatening to boil over. Amanda leaned back in her chair, her expression hardening into something unyielding. "This isn't rare, David. The system's built to shield men like Parker. It's not just him, it's the whole damn structure that props him up." David slammed the file shut, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the quiet room. "Then we ripped that structure apart, piece by piece," he said, his voice low and fierce, a promise carved in stone. The next day, Amanda's phone buzzed with a cryptic text that sent a jolt through her, security footage tampered, with "Meet me 8 p.m., South Point Garage. Come alone." Her pulse quickened as she dialed David, skipping any pleasantries. "We've got a lead," she said, her words clipped and urgent. On the other end, David's response was immediate, resolute. "I'm in." Amanda hesitated, her mind racing through the risks. "No, David, if this goes wrong, your involvement could tank the case." His voice sharpened, cutting through her caution. "This is about my son, Amanda. If there's even a sliver of a chance to uncover what really happened, I'm Terrain, no question." She sighed, relenting under the weight of his determination. "Fine, but we play this smart." At exactly 8 p.m., they pulled into the South Point Garage, a cavernous concrete maze bathed in weak, flickering light. A man emerged from the shadow's late 30s, lean, dressed in a faded hoodie and jeans, his eyes darting nervously. He clutched a flash drive like it was a lifeline. "You the lawyer?" he asked, his voice a hushed rasp. Amanda nodded. "You've got the footage." He thrust the drive into her hand, his fingers trembling. "This is the real feed. Shows everything Parker did before he pulled the trigger." Kid had his hands up. "The edited that out. Departments covering their tracks." David stepped closer, his presence towering. "How do we know this isn't fake?" The man met his gaze, unflinching despite his nerves. You don't. But I'm done watching them get away with it. Just watch your backs. They'll come for you if they know you've got this. As if summoned by his warning, the screech of tires tore through the garage. Headlights sliced through the gloom as a black SUV barreled toward them. Run, the man yelled. Bolting into the darkness, Amanda and David sprinted for the nearest exit, the flash drive burning a hole in her pocket. The SUV skidded to a stop, disgorging two men in plain clothes. Their faces obscured, but their intent clear. David shoved Amanda forward. Goyle held them off. She grabbed his arm, her voice a furious hiss. Are you out of your mind? We don't have time for heroics. He shook her off, snatching a rusted metal pipe from the ground. No time to argue. One of the pursuers lunged, and David swung hard, the pipe connecting with a sickening thud against the man's ribs. The attacker stumbled back, cursing, but his partner charged on. Amanda reached the stairwell, turning to see David locked in a frantic struggle. "David, move," she shouted. He shoved the dazed man aside and bolted after her, their footsteps pounding down the stairs in a chaotic rhythm. Outside, they spotted Amanda's car glinting under a street lamp. They dove in just as the SUV roared out behind them. "Drive," David barked. Amanda floored it, tires shrieking as they peeled away, the SUV's headlights glaring in the rearview mirror. "They're not backing off," she said, her teeth clenched as she swerved around a parked car. David rolled down his window, snagging a loose brick from the floorboard. With a grunt, he hurled it at the SUV's windshield. Glass exploded on impact, and the vehicle veered wildly, slowing just enough to give them an edge. "That bought us a minute," Amanda muttered, her hands locked on the wheel. After a heart-pounding chase, they lost the tail, pulling into a narrow alley to catch their ragged breaths. Amanda gripped the flash drive, her voice steady despite the adrenaline. "This footage's proof Parker lied. It's proof they covered it up." David leaned back, chest heaving. "Then we make damn sure the world sees it." The next morning, in Amanda's cluttered office, they huddled over her laptop, the unedited footage playing in stark, brutal clarity. Michael Carter, 19, lanky and unarmed, walked away from the property line. Hands raised in surrender, Parker's shout rang out, harsh and unprovoked, followed by the crack of a gunshot. The screen froze on Michael's crumpled form. "They cut those seconds," Amanda said, disgust dripping from her words. Without this, Parker's story might have stuck. David stared at the screen, his face a mask of grief and rage, his silence louder than any outburst. "This isn't just a mistake," he finally said, his voice hollow. "It's murder and they tried to bury it." Amanda nodded, her resolve hardening. "We don't stop at Parker. We expose the whole system that let this happen." As whispers of the footage spread, the police department unraveled. Captain Harris summoned Parker to his office, slamming a newspaper onto his desk. The headline screamed, "Unaltered footage raises questions about officers' actions." "What the hell did you do?" Harris roared, his face red with fury. Parker stood rigid, his throat dry. "I don't know what you're talking about." Harris jabbed a finger at him. "Don't play dumb. That video's out there. They know you lied. And worse, they know someone here tried to hide it." Parker's defiance faltered, his voice small. "I didn't ask for a cover-up." Harris leaned in, his breath hot. "Maybe not, but now we're all targets. Get a lawyer yesterday." Meanwhile, David and Amanda pored over their case late into the night. Every detail a brick in their fortress of truth. Parker's complaint triddled past. The doctored report, the damning footage. In a quiet moment, Amanda looked at David, her voice soft but fierce. "This isn't just about Michael anymore. If we win, we crack open the rot in this system." David's eyes burned with purpose. "Then we fight until the truth is undeniable." With evidence in hand and a fire in their hearts, they prepared to face a courtroom battle that could topple an empire of corruption, proving that justice, though delayed, could still strike with unrelenting force. For Michael, for every silenced voice, they would not rest not until the system that shielded its own faced the consequences of its sins. The courtroom buzzed with a restless energy as Amanda Green rose from her seat, her heels clicking sharply against the polished wooden floor. She turned to face the jury, her chestnut eyes blazing with a fire fueled by conviction. Her voice, steady at first, swelled with raw emotion as she addressed them, each word dripping with the weight of the moment. By the time this trial draws to a close, the evidence will paint a picture so undeniable that you'll be left with no choice but to see Officer John Parker's actions for what they truly weren't a mere lapse in judgment, but a deliberate and criminal betrayal of the trust placed in him. The air grew thick with silence as her words settled over the room like a heavy fog. She held the jurors' gazes, her stare piercing and unyielding, as if challenging them to meet her intensity or shrink beneath it. Slowly, she returned to her seat, her posture rigid with purpose, her mind racing with the stakes of what lay ahead. Across the room, Judge Grant's voice cut through the stillness, firm and authoritative. Defense. Your opening statement. Peter Lawson, Officer Parker's attorney, rose with a practiced ease. He tugged at the knot of his navy tie, smoothing it against his crisp white shirt before stepping into the center of the courtroom. His movements were deliberate, almost theatrical, exuding a calm that seemed to mock the tension Amanda had just stoked. "Good morning," he began, his voice smooth and measured, like a man reciting a well-rehearsed script. "What we have before us is a tragedy, a gut-wrenching, unspeakable tragedy. Michael Carter's death is a wound that cuts deep, and my client, Officer John Parker, will bear the scars of that night until his last breath." He pivoted slightly, his eyes sweeping over the jury with a calculated softness. "But let me be clear, heartbreak does not equate to guilt." Officer Parker was answering a call about a suspicious figure in the dark. He walked into a pressure cooker, a situation where every second demanded a choice. In that fleeting, chaotic moment, he acted on what he believed was his duty to shield the community from harm. Lawson took a step closer to the jury box, his polished shoes gleaming under the fluorescent lights. "I ask you to see my client not as a monster, but as a man-flawed human, and vulnerable to the mistakes we all make when the weight of the world presses down. This trial isn't about crucifying someone for being imperfect. It's about untangling the messy reality of that night and holding it up against the cold letter of the law." With a somber nod, he retreated to his seat, his face etched with a practiced melancholy that lingered in the room. The prosecution didn't hesitate to seize the momentum. Amanda strode forward, her jaw set, as a technician fumbled with cables to cue up the body camera footage. She positioned herself beside the monitor, her voice cutting through the hum of anticipation. "This video," she said, turning to the jury with a gravity that seemed to pull the room inward, "holds the truth of what happened to Michael Carter. Watch it carefully, every frame, every sound." The lights dimmed, casting long shadows across the courtroom, and the screen flickered to life. Parker's voice boomed from the speakers, sharp and commanding. "Stop right there. Drop the ball." The jurors leaned forward, their eyes locked on the grainy image of Michael Carter, a young man in a faded hoodie, his basketball thudding to the pavement as he raised his hands high. Parker's figure loomed closer, his tone hardening with each step. "I said don't move." Michael's response came soft but steady, a thread of fear woven through his calm. "I'm not moving. I'm just trying to explain." The crack of a gunshot shattered the audio, freezing the frame on Michael's startled face. The jurors recoiled, a collective gasp rippling through the gallery like a stone dropped into still water. Amanda let the silence stretch, heavy and suffocating, before stepping forward. "You saw it with your own eyes," she said, her voice low but resonant. Michael Carter's hands were up. He was no threat. And yet, Officer Parker chose to fire. Lawson shot to his feet, his chair scraping loudly. "Objection, Your Honor. The footage can't show what Officer Parker saw or felt in that moment." Judge Grant's gavel hovered briefly before she spoke. "Overruled. The jury will decide what it sees." Her tone was clipped, her eyes narrowing as she waved him down. Outside, the courthouse steps had become a battleground of clashing voices. Protesters hoisted signs demanding justice for Michael, their chants rising in a rhythmic swell that echoed off the stone walls. Across the divide, counter-protesters waved banners proclaiming "Support our police and criminals deserve consequences," their shouts jagged and defiant. At the edge of the fray stood Maya Carter, Michael's older sister, her fingers trembling as they clutched a creased photo of her brother, his wide grin frozen in time. A burly man in a faded cap pushed through the crowd toward her, his lip curling into a sneer. Maybe if your brother had listened, he'd still be breathing. Maya's head snapped up, her dark eyes flashing with a fury she could barely leash. She stepped closer, her voice steady despite the quake in her chest. He was listening. His hands were up, and they gunned him down anyway. The man scoffed, but the air between them crackled with unspoken rage. Around them, the tension erupted, shouts turned to shoves, fists clenched, and bodies collided until a line of officers in riot gear wedged through, forcing the crowds apart. Maya stood her ground, her breath ragged, her anger a live wire sparking beneath her skin. Back inside, Amanda called her first witness, a middle-aged woman named Ellen Harper, who had watched the nightmare unfold from her kitchen window. Ellen shuffled to the stand, her floral blouse wrinkled from nervous fidgeting, her graying hair pulled into a loose bun. "Miss Harper," Amanda began gently, "tell us what you saw that night." Ellen's voice quavered as she spoke, her hands twisting in her lap. "I was washing dishes when I saw Michael pick up his basketball from the grass. He was heading back to the court, just a kid enjoying the evening. Then the patrol car screeched up, and the officer Parker zoomed out, yelling at him to stop." Amanda leaned in, her tone coaxing. "What happened next?" Ellen's voice steadied, her memory sharpening. "Michael dropped the ball right away. His hands went up, high and clear. He wasn't doing a thing wrong. Then the officer shot him, just like that." Lawson rose for his turn, his posture relaxed, but his eyes keen. "Mrs. Harper, you were about 50 feet away, correct?" She nodded. "And it was dark out," he pressed, his tone laced with doubt. "Could you really see Michael's hands the whole time?" Ellen faltered, her brow creasing. "I saw enough to know he wasn't a threat." Lawson tilted his head, a faint smirk tugging at his lips. "Enough, but not everything, right?" Ellen's frown deepened, but she held her tongue, her silence a quiet defiance. During a break, David Carter, Michael's father, slumped against a hallway bench beside Amanda. His broad shoulders sagged under an invisible weight, his calloused hands rubbing at his temples. "They're picking apart every little thing," he muttered, frustration bleeding into his voice. Amanda rested a hand on his arm, her touch steadying. "That's their game, David. They'll twist and dodge, but they can't rewrite what's on that tape." He nodded, though his jaw remained locked tight, his mind churning with the image of Parker's retreating figure as the session ended. The officer had kept his head down, avoiding the gallery's stares as deputies flanked him out. David's fists curled, his knuckles whitening. "He doesn't look so sure of himself now," Maya said, stepping up beside him, her voice sharp with bitter satisfaction. "He shouldn't be," David replied, his tone low and resolute. "This is just the start." The trial pressed on, the courtroom a pressure cooker of mounting stakes. Amanda called Dr. Evelyn Carterno, relation to Michaela, poised expert in racial bias, whose dark suit and steely demeanor commanded attention as she took the stand. "Dr. Carter," Amanda began, "tell us about your research on systemic bias in policing." Evelyn folded her hands, her voice crisp and unshakable. "Our data reveals a stark pattern. Black individuals are far more likely to be seen as threats by law enforcement, not because of their actions, but due to deep-seated societal biases officers carry whether they realize it or not." Amanda gestured toward the footage still looming in the jury's minds. "How does this connect to Michael Carter?" Evelyn pointed to a chart projected on the screen, her tone unwavering. Michael showed no aggression. His hands were raised. Yet Officer Parker's choice to shoot fits a documented trend: unwarranted escalation against black individuals. Lawson leapt up, his voice sharp. "Objection, Your Honor. This is pure speculation." Judge Grant's gaze flicked to Amanda. "Keep it specific, Miss Green." Amanda nodded smoothly. "Dr. Carter, based on the evidence, was there any reason for Parker to see Michael as a threat?" Evelyn's answer was a blade. "None." Murmurs rippled through the room, a tide of unease. Next came Detective Luis Ramirez, a weary young officer whose unexpected testimony sent a jolt through the gallery. His uniform was pristine, but his eyes betrayed a storm of conflict as he settled into the stand. "Detective Ramirez," Amanda said, "you worked with Officer Parker. What can you tell us about his conduct?" Luis shifted, his Adam's apple bobbing as he swallowed. Parker had a habit of blowing things out of proportion. He'd jump to the worst conclusions, especially with people of color. Amanda pressed gently. "Can you give us an example?" Luce's jaw tightened. "Last year, during a traffic stop, a black driver reached for his registration in the glove box. Parker yanked his gun out, screaming the guy was armed. There was no weapon, just papers. Lawson pounced. Officers are trained to be cautious, aren't they?" Luis nodded reluctantly. "Sure, but Parker didn't stop at caution. He ran on fear and prejudice, not facts." The gallery buzzed, and Judge Grant's gavel cracked the air. Later, Chief Thomas Warner took the stand, his broad frame dwarfing the witness box. His eye was askew, his face etched with discomfort as he avoided Amanda's gaze. "Chief Warner," she began, her voice honed to a razor's edge. "How many complaints has Officer Parker racked up?" Warner shifted, his gravelly voice low. 12. "And how many led to discipline?" She pressed. "None," he admitted, his shoulders slumping. "Why not?" Amanda's tone sharpened, her eyes boring into him. "The evidence wasn't strong enough for action," he mumbled, but the words sounded hollow. Amanda stepped closer, her presence towering despite her smaller stature. Or was it because the department cared more about shielding its own than holding them accountable? Lawson's objection, argumentative, came fast, but Amanda withdrew the question with a cool smile, leaving the accusation to fester in the silence. "Chief," she continued, "did that lack of accountability pave the way for Michael Carter's death?" Warner hesitated, his lips parting, but no answer carrying the weight of what he couldn't deny. As the trial unfolded, each witness peeled back another layer of a system rotten with unchecked power. Justice, Amanda knew, wasn't just about punishing Parker, it was about exposing the consequences of a world where authority could snuff out a life without reason and walk away unscathed. Outside, the crowds grew louder, their voices a chorus of rage and hope. Inside, the jury watched, their faces a gallery of doubt, fear, and dawning realization. The lesson was clear: power without restraint was a loaded gun, and Michael Carter had paid the price. The courtroom was thick with tension, a heavy stillness settling over the space as the prosecution concluded its arguments for the day. The judge's gavel struck the bench with a sharp crack, signaling a temporary pause in the proceedings, but the weight of what had unfolded lingered in the air like a storm cloud refusing to break. The system, he'd admitted earlier in a voice tight with reluctance, wasn't perfect. It had cracks, deep ones he couldn't deny. Yet those words felt hollow, strained, as if dragged from him against his will. Inside those four walls, the battle for truth raged on, but beyond them, the world was erupting into something far louder, far more chaotic. Outside, the streets pulsed with unrest. The chants of protesters rolled through the city like thunder, their voices rising and falling in a relentless tide of anger and grief. Signs bobbed above the crowd, stark white with bold black letters, "Justice for Michael." The words were a plea, a demand, a cry that refused to be ignored. But they weren't alone. Across the street, a smaller but no less fierce group of counter-protesters pushed back, their own signs slashing through the air. "Support our police." The clash of ideals wasn't just visible, it was deafening. A cacophony of shouts and accusations that drowned out any hope of quiet. At the heart of the swelling crowd stood Maya Carter, her slender frame unyielding despite the chaos swirling around her. Her sign was simple, its message raw and personal: "My brother's life mattered." She clutched it with both hands, her knuckles whitening as she stared into the sea of faces, some supportive, others hostile. A knot of counter-protesters broke away from their line, weaving through the throng toward her. Their steps were heavy, purposeful, their eyes glinting with something dark. A man in a worn jacket stepped forward, his voice slicing through the noise like a blade. "Your brother was a thug," he spat, his lip curling as he loomed closer. "He got what was coming." Maya's heart lurched, a jolt of pain and fury igniting in her chest. She turned to face him, her dark eyes blazing, her voice steady despite the tremor threatening to break it. "He was a college student," she shot back, each word deliberate. Carved from the depths of her grief, an engineer with dreams, with a future. He wasn't a threat. He wasn't a criminal. Her words hung between them, sharp and unyielding, but the man only sneered, stepping closer still. He didn't belong in that neighborhood. he said, his tone dripping with contempt. That's what happens when people like you forget your place. The air crackled with tension, a live wire ready to snap, before Maya could respond. A sudden scuffle erupted nearby, a tangle of shoving bodies, raised voices, and flailing fists. The crowd surged, protesters and counter-protesters colliding in a chaotic blur. Maya's breath caught as she stumbled back, her sign slipping slightly in her grip. Then came the heavy thud of boots on pavementry, at police descending like a dark wave, their batons gleaming under the streetlights. Tear gas canisters hit the ground with a metallic clank, hissing as they unleashed plumes of choking smoke. The sting hit Maya instantly, her eyes watering, her throat burning as she coughed into her sleeve. She staggered, the world tilting around her, until a firm hand grabbed her arm. "Come on, Maya, we've got to go." It was her friend Leela, her voice urgent as she tugged at Maya's sleeve. Lila's wide eyes darted through the haze, her short braids swinging as she pulled harder. But Maya shook her head, planting her feet despite the tears streaming down her face. "No," she said, her voice raw but resolute. "I'm not running. Not this time." Before Leela could argue, the crowd pressed in tighter, and Maya lost her balance. Crashing to the pavement, the asphalt bit into her palms as she hit the ground, a sharp gasp escaping her lips. Leela was at her side in an instant, hauling her up with a strength born of desperation. "This isn't worth dying for," Leela shouted over the din, but Maya's gaze was fixed ahead, unyielding, even as the chaos swallowed them whole. Back inside the courtroom the next day, the atmosphere was no less charged. Amanda Pierce, the defense attorney, stood at the center of the room, her posture calm but her eyes sharp with purpose. She'd spent the night poring over notes, replaying every moment of the trial in her mind, her thoughts a whirlwind of strategy and resolve. Now, she called her next witness, Olivia Tran, a tech expert whose quiet confidence belied the bombshell she was about to drop. Olivia took the stand, her dark hair pulled back tightly, her hands folded neatly in her lap as she faced the jury. Amanda's voice rang out, steady and commanding. "Miss Tran, what did your analysis reveal about the security footage provided by the police?" Olivia didn't hesitate, her tone as firm as stone. "The footage was altered," she said, her words landing like a hammer in the hushed room. "Key moments, specifically those showing Michael Carter raising his hands and stepping away, were deliberately removed." A ripple of murmurs swept through the jury, their faces tightening with shock, suspicion, doubt. Amanda stepped forward, clicking a remote to project the unedited footage onto a screen. The grainy image froze on a single frame. Michael, his hands lifted high, his body angled away from the officer. "This," Amanda said, her voice rising with controlled fury as she pointed to the screen, "is what the police didn't want you to see." Michael Carter was retreating, defenseless, when Officer Parker opened fire. The gallery erupted into a storm of whispers, a wave of disbelief and outrage that prompted the judge to slam his gavel again, the sound cutting through the noise like a gunshot. Lawson, the prosecution's lead attorney, shot to his feet, his sharp features taut with frustration. "Miss Tran," he snapped, his voice edged with accusation, "are you implying the entire department conspired to tamper with this evidence?" Olivia met his gaze without flinching, her calm unshaken. "I'm not implying anything," she replied coolly. "I'm stating a fact. The footage was manipulated to shield Officer Parker." In a private room after the session, Officer Parker slumped in a chair, his broad shoulders hunched as if the weight of the day had crushed him. His hands trembled faintly as he dragged them through his close-cropped hair, his breath shallow and uneven. "They're burying us," he muttered, his voice thick with dread. That footage didn't even know it was out there. His attorney, Lawson, stood by the window, his arms crossed, his sigh heavy with exhaustion. "They're not just coming for you," he said, turning to face Parker with a grim look. "They're unraveling the whole system. We need to shift gears, focus on containment." Parker's eyes flashed with bitterness, his jaw clenching. "They're making me the fall guy," he said, his voice low and venomous. Lawson didn't sugarcoat it. "Whether that's true or not, the jury only sees one thing: your finger on the trigger." That evening, in Amanda's dimly lit office, the air was thick with fatigue and determination. David Carter sat across from her, his broad frame slouched slightly in the chair, his face etched with the exhaustion of a man who'd lost too much. Amanda set her notes down on the cluttered desk, her fingers lingering on the pages as she spoke. "They're starting to see it," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "The jury, they are glimpsing the bigger picture now." David nodded. Though his eyes were shadowed with doubt, his lips pressed into a thin line. "But will it be enough?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion. "Will it actually change anything?" Amanda leaned forward, meeting his gaze with unwavering resolve. "If we win, it's a start. But we can't let up, not for a second." David's jaw tightened, his hands curling into fists. "Then we keep going," he said, his tone hardening with a father's unbreakable will. "Not until the system pays for my son's life and every other life it's stolen." Outside, the unrest mirrored the mounting tension within. The crowd gathered before the courthouse had swollen to a massive throng, their chants reverberating through the downtown streets like a heartbeat of fury. What had begun as a somber vigil had morphed into something volatile, a powder keg teetering on the edge of explosion. Signs demanding justice for Michael waved high, their messages underscored by shouts for accountability, for change. Maya stood near the front, a megaphone trembling slightly in her hands as she raised it to her lips. "We won't be silenced," she cried, her voice cutting through the clamor with a strength she barely felt. "Michael deserved to live, and we won't stop until justice is served not just for him, but for everyone this broken system has failed." The crowd roared in response, a wave of agreement that shook the air. But her words drew venom from the counter-protesters lurking at the edges. A knot of them pushed forward, their signs back the blue, "Obey the law," held like shields. A burly man in a military-style jacket shoved through the barrier, his face flushed with rage as he bellowed, "Your brother was a criminal. He got what he deserved." Maya whirled to face him, her grip on the megaphone tightening until her fingers ached. "He was unarmed," she shot back, her voice trembling with fury. He raised his hands. "That's not a crime, I'd surrender." The man stepped closer, his sneer deepening. If he'd stayed where he belonged, he'd still be breathing. Before Maya could fire back, a bottle sailed through the air from the counter-protester's side, shattering against the pavement in a spray of glass. The crowd erupted, a surge of panic and rage swallowing the scene. Police moved in swiftly, their batons raised, their shouts lost in the din as tear gas canisters clattered to the ground. The smoke billowed thick and acrid, clawing at Maya's lungs as she stumbled, coughing violently. Her vision blurred, the world a haze of stinging tears and shoving bodies. A hand grabbed her Leela again, pulling with frantic strength. "Maya, move." But then David appeared, his tall frame cutting through the chaos, his face a mask of grim determination. "Maya," he shouted, gripping her shoulders as another canister landed nearby. Hissing with fresh smoke, "We're leaving now." "I'm not going," she yelled back, her voice hoarse as she fought to stand her ground. But David's grip tightened, unyielding. "You don't have a choice," he snapped, dragging her toward an alley as the gas thickened around them. She stumbled, her knees buckling, but he kept her upright, half carrying her until they reached the narrow passageway. They collapsed against the brick wall, gasping for air, the distant roar of the protest echoing behind them. Maya wiped her eyes, her chest heaving as anger surged anew. "They're trying to shut us up," she said, her voice shaking with defiance. David's gaze was steely, unwavering. "They can try," he said, "but we're not finishing it by a long shot." Later that night, the Carter family home was steeped in unease. Helena Carter sat on the living room couch, her arms wrapped tightly around herself as she stared at the flickering TV screen. News footage replayed the protests' descent into chaos, flashing lights, swinging batons, scattered signs. "This is getting worse," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper, her fingers digging into her sleeves. "It's only a matter of time before someone gets hurt or worse." David sank onto the cushion beside her, his face haggard, his eyes hollow with exhaustion. "We knew it wouldn't be easy," he said, his tone heavy. "Real change never is." Helena turned to him, her voice rising with a mix of fear and frustration. "Change is one thing. David, this is violence. Maya could have been killed out there today." Before he could answer, A sudden crash shattered the quiet, unmistakable sound of glass splintering. They leapt to their feet, hearts pounding as Maya appeared at the top of the stairs, her eyes wide with alarm. "Dad!" David moved swiftly to the front door, yanking it open to reveal a brick lying amid a scatter of jagged shards in the entryway. A crude note clung to it, scrawled in red marker, "Go back where you belong." Helena's hand flew to her mouth, her face draining of color. "Oh my God," she whispered. David picked up the brick, his hands shaking with barely contained rage as he stepped onto the porch. Scanning the darkened street, the culprit was long gone, swallowed by the night. Maya joined him, her jaw tight, her voice steady despite the fear flickering in her eyes. "They want us scared," she said. David turned to her, his expression hardening into something fierce. "They're going to regret that." By morning, word of the attack had spread like wildfire through the neighborhood. Neighbors, many of whom had rallied behind Michael's memory, trickled over to help. An older man named Mr. Ellis, who lived 2 houses down, arrived with plywood and a handful of nails, his weathered hands steady as he boarded up the broken window. "They want to tear us apart," he said gruffly, hammering a nail into place. "But they don't get it. We're tougher than that when we're together." A group of teenagers showed up next, paint cans in hand, their chatter lively as they scrubbed away the graffiti sprayed across the driveway, "Leave or die." Maya watched them work, her chest swelling with a quiet, bittersweet pride. "We're not going anywhere," she said softly to one of the boys, a lanky kid with a bright grin. "We wouldn't let you even if you tried," he replied, his brush swiping a bold streak of white over the hateful words. That evening, the Carters gathered in their living room, the boarded-up window casting eerie shadows across the space. The air was thick with a stubborn resolve, a refusal to bend. David broke the silence, his voice low but firm. "We need to figure out what's next." Helena shook her head, her hands twisting in her lap. "What's next? They're attacking us, David. Our home isn't safe anymore." He met her gaze, unwavering. "That's exactly why we don't stop. If we give in now, they've won, and I'll be damned if I let that happen." Maya leaned forward, her eyes blazing with a fire that mirrored her father's. "Protests aren't enough anymore," she said. "We need to hit harder, dig deeper. This isn't just about Michael, it's about justice, real justice, and the cost of power when it's abused." The lesson was clear, woven into every shattered window, every tear-streaked face, every raised voice. Justice wasn't a gift handed down, it was a fight, a brutal, unrelenting struggle against a system that thrived on silence and submission. And the consequences of unchecked power, they rippled outward, leaving broken lives and burning streets in their wake. For the Carters, for the crowd outside, for every soul caught in this storm, the battle was far from over. It was only beginning. As dusk settled over the Carter household, a heavy stillness hung in the air, pierced only by the distant hum of crickets. Inside, Helen Carter paced the creaky wooden floor of their modest living room, her hands twisting together in a nervous dance. The day's events replayed in her mind like a relentless stormed brick that had shattered their front window, the venomous threats scrawled in jagged letters, the raw violence that had erupted in their quiet neighborhood. Each memory clawed at her, threatening to unravel the fragile threads of her composure. "We have to show them we're not afraid," she murmured, her voice trembling yet laced with defiance. Her eyes darted toward David, her husband, who stood by the window, peering out into the shadowed street. His broad shoulders were tense, his jaw set in a hard line, but there was a flicker of something softer in his gaze, a concern, perhaps, or exhaustion. David turned to her, his footsteps deliberate as he crossed the room. He rested a steady hand on her shoulder, his touch warm and grounding. "And how do we do that without losing everything, without getting killed?" she asked, her voice cracking under the weight of her fear. David's eyes met hers, steady and resolute. "We fight smart, Helen," he said, his tone low but firm. "We don't charge in with fists or fury. We take this to court. We drag the truth out into the open, where the whole world can see it. That's how we win, not just for us, but for Michael." His words carried a quiet strength, a promise forged in grief and determination. Helen nodded slowly, her chest tightening as she clung to that fragile hope. The threats had been meant to break them, to silence their cries for justice, but instead, They had ignited something fiercer within the Carter familiar resolve as unyielding as steel. Night deepened, wrapping the house in a shroud of darkness, but the Carters remained vigilant. The air inside buzzed with unspoken tension, each creak of the floorboards amplifying their alertness. Maya, their teenage daughter, sat curled on the couch, her knees drawn to her chest, her dark eyes wide and searching. She hadn't spoken much since the chaos of the day, but her silence spoke messenger sorrow, and a budding courage simmered beneath her quiet exterior. The brick, the shouts, the flashing lights, they lingered in her mind, vivid and unrelenting. Yet, as she watched her parents, their strength seeped into her, bolstering her own. They weren't crumbling under the weight of intimidation, they were rising, and she would rise with them. Days later, the courtroom became their battleground, a stark chamber of wood and stone where justice hung in the balance. The air was thick with anticipation, every breath heavy with the stakes at hand. Amanda Green, the family's attorney, stood tall before Judge Evelyn Grant, her presence commanding yet composed. Her auburn hair was pulled back tightly, accentuating the sharp determination in her green eyes. A technician wheeled in a monitor, its screen flickering to life with an eerie glow that cast long shadows across the room. The spectators, reporters, supporters, and a handful of skeptics leaned forward, their whispers fading into a tense hush. "Your Honor," Amanda began, her voice steady but brimming with purpose, "today, the prosecution will unveil evidence that has been buried, hidden from sight by those who fear its power. This evidence will illuminate the truth of what happened the night Michael Carter's life was stolen." Judge Grant, a woman of stern dignity with silver-streaked hair and piercing gray eyes, gave a measured nod from her elevated bench. "Proceed," she said, her tone clipped yet authoritative, betraying no hint of the storm brewing within her own thoughts. She had presided over countless cases, but this one carried a weight that gnawed at her justice. She knew was a fragile thing, easily warped by power and deceit. Amanda turned to the jury, 12 ordinary souls tasked with an extraordinary burden, and locked eyes with each of them. "What you're about to see," she said, her voice cutting through the silence, "is the unedited footage from a security camera near the scene of the shooting. It stands in direct opposition to Officer Parker's testimony and the falsified police report." The lights dimmed, plunging the room into a muted glow as the video sprang to life. On the screen, Michael Carter emerged into the frame, a lanky 19-year-old with a basketball tucked under his arm. His movements were casual, almost carefree, as he glanced around the dimly lit street. He wore a faded hoodie and sneakers scuffed from countless games on the Curta boy. On the cusp of manhood, unaware that these would be his final steps, he turned, heading back toward the basketball court, when Officer Daniel Parker stormed into view. The cop's gun was already drawn, glinting menacingly under the streetlights, his posture rigid with aggression. "Stop right there. Drop the ball," Parker bellowed, his voice echoing with a harshness that made the courtroom flinch. Michael froze, his body tensing as the ball slipped from his grasp and rolled across the pavement. Slowly, deliberately, he raised his hands, palms open to the sky. "I'm just getting my ball," he said, his voice steady but tinged with a tremor of fear that betrayed his youth. The camera captured every detail, his wide eyes darting toward the gun, his shallow breaths fogging faintly in the cool night air. Parker advanced, his weapon unwavering, his face a mask of fury and control. "Don't move," he shouted again, though Michael had already stilled. The boy took a hesitant step back, hands still raised, a silent plea for reason in his posture. Then, the gunshot shattered the silence, a deafening crack that sent a collective gasp rippling through the courtroom. The screen froze on Michael's collapse, his body crumpling onto the dew-slicked grass, the basketball rolling to a stop beside him. Amanda paused the video, letting the image sear itself into the jury's minds. She turned to them, her expression unwavering. This footage was excluded from the original evidence submitted by the police. Crucial seconds that show Michael complying with every order, posing no threat, were deliberately erased. Peter Lawson, the defense attorney, shot to his feet, his tailored suit impeccable, but his face flushed with indignation. "Your Honor, this evidence wasn't disclosed during discovery. The defense hasn't had time to examine it," His voice carried a sharp edge, but beneath it lingered a hint of desperation. Amanda didn't waver. "Your Honor, the prosecution only recently obtained this footage. It was intentionally withheld, a fact we can and will substantiate." Judge Grant raised a hand, her expression unreadable yet stern. "Ms. Green, you'll need to verify the authenticity of this evidence. For now, it remains on record. Continue." Amanda nodded and faced the jury once more. "The defense argues that Officer Parker acted in self-defense, that he perceived Michael Carter as a threat. But this footage tells a different story, a story of a young man, unarmed, compliant, and gunned down without cause." Lawson rose again, his tone biting. "The video only shows a fragment of the encounter. It doesn't reveal what Officer Parker felt in that moment, what he believed he saw." Amanda's gaze sharpened, pinning him where he stood. "What Officer Parker felt doesn't justify executing an unarmed man with his hands in the air. Perception is not a license to kill." The gallery erupted into a low roar of murmurs, a wave of emotion crashing against the courtroom's rigid decorum. Judge Grant slammed her gavel, the sound reverberating like a thunderclap. "Order in the court," she commanded, her voice slicing through the chaos until silence reclaimed the room. Amanda called her next witness, Olivia Tran, a forensic video analyst with a calm demeanor and an unshakable confidence. Olivia adjusted her glasses as she took the stand, her slight frame belying the weight of her expertise. "Ms. Tran," Amanda began, "can you confirm that this footage is unaltered and matches the original timestamp from that night?" Olivia nodded, her voice clear and precise. "Yes. The metadata verifies this is the authentic, unedited recording. The version initially provided to the police had been tampered with. 5 critical seconds were removed." Amanda stepped closer, her presence magnetic. "And what did those 5 seconds reveal?" Olivia pointed to the frozen image on the screen, her finger steady. "They show Michael Carter raising his hands in full compliance, attempting to calm the situation before he was shot." The gallery stirred again, a ripple of shock and outrage. Lawson stood for cross-examination, his skepticism palpable. "Ms. Tran, isn't it possible those missing seconds were an accidental omission, a technical error, perhaps?" Olivia didn't flinch. "No. Removing those seconds required intentional editing. It was no mistake." Outside the courthouse, the atmosphere crackled with electricity. Protesters lined the steps, their voices rising in a fervent chant, "Justice for Michael. Stop the lies," their signs swaying like banners in a storm. Among them stood Maya Carter, her petite frame dwarfed by the crowd but her presence fierce. Her dark hair whipped in the wind as she watched the chaos unfold, her heart pounding with a mix of grief and pride. "They're scared," she said softly to a fellow protester, a weary young man named Jamal who clutched a megaphone. "They know the truth is slipping out, and they can't stop it." Jamal nodded, his own anger tempered by hope. "We're here for Michael and for every kid like him. This ends now." Across the street, a shrinking knot of counter-protesters clung to their own narrative, their signs reading, "Officers protect us and don't criminalize police." Their voices were drowned out by the swelling tide of outrage, their numbers thinning as the new evidence tipped the scales. Tensions flared when a bottle sailed from their ranks, shattering against the pavement and igniting a scuffle. Riot police surged forward, their shields glinting under the floodlights, forcing the crowds apart as shouts and shoves teetered on the brink of anarchy. Inside, Officer Parker sat at the defense table, his once confident demeanor crumbling. His uniform felt tight, suffocating, as sweat beaded on his pale forehead. He leaned toward Lawson, his voice a ragged whisper. "They're destroying me. That footage, how did they get it?" His hands trembled, betraying the panic clawing at his chest. Lawson, ever the composed strategist, kept his tone even. "Focus, Daniel. They haven't won yet. We'll fight this." But Parker's eyes darted wildly, haunted by the image of Michael's fall, a moment he couldn't unsee, a choice he couldn't undo. During a recess, David Carter found Amanda in a cramped side room, the air thick with the scent of stale coffee. His tall frame loomed as he spoke, his voice steady but laced with urgency. "This footage hides the nail in the coffin, Amanda. It's over for him." Amanda nodded, though her brow furrowed with caution. "It's damning, David, no question. But we're not done." The jury needs to see Parker's actions as part of a bigger rota system that let him stay on the force despite every red flag. David's jaw clenched, his grief hardening into purpose. Then we show them all of every complaint, every cover-up. This isn't just about Parker anymore. It's about the whole damn machine. Amanda placed a hand on his shoulder, mirroring his earlier gesture to Helen. That's exactly what we're going to do. When court resumed, Amanda displayed the edited footage alongside the unedited version. The contrast stark and undeniable. The jury leaned forward, their faces a gallery of shock and contemplation, as she highlighted each discrepancy. This, she said, pointing to the altered clip, is what the police handed over a lie polished to protect one of their own. And this, she gestured to the full recording, is the truth they tried to bury. Ask yourselves, why would they hide it if they had nothing to fear? Lawson rose for his closing argument of the day, his voice smooth but strained. Ladies and gentlemen, you've heard a lot of accusations today. But remember, Officer Parker was responding to a suspicious person in a high-stress moment. He acted to protect himself and the community. The edited footage doesn't change the split-second choice he faced. Amanda countered swiftly, her words a blade. Split-second decisions don't excuse murder. And covering up the truth isn't a defense, it's an admission of guilt. As the day drew to a close, the courtroom spilled into a throng of reporters and protesters. David stood outside with Helen and Maya flanking him, facing a sea of supporters. He held up a copy of the footage, his voice ringing out. This is the truth they tried to silence. But Michael's voice will not be buried. We'll see this through, no matter what it takes. The crowd roared, their chants swelling justice for Michael, a tidal wave of defiance crashing against the night. The trial's momentum had shifted with the footage's revelation, but the verdict loomed like a storm on the horizon. Inside the courthouse, Amanda prepared her closing argument, her heart pounding with the weight of what lay ahead. The room fell silent as she stood, her gaze sweeping the jury with a mix of resolve and sorrow. Ladies and gentlemen, she began, her voice steady yet resonant with emotion. This case is more than a single tragedy. It's about the choices that built Officer Parker's choice to see an unarmed young man as a threat, to pull the trigger despite raised hands, and a system's choice to shield him despite a trail of recklessness and bias. She gestured to the monitor, where Michael's final moments remained frozen, a haunting testament etched in pixels. This image is the story. Michael complied. He was no danger. Yet he was cut down by prejudice and power unchecked. Her voice rose, filling the space with raw conviction. The defense calls it a tragic mistake. But mistakes don't come with doctored evidence. Mistakes don't come with lies to hide the blood on their hands. Michael Carter was no criminal, was a son, a brother, a dreamer with a scholarship in his pocket and a future stretching out before him. And because of one man's abuse of power and a system that enabled it, that future was stolen. She paused, letting the silence underscore her words. A lesson in justice and consequence reverberating through the room. You hold the power now to say that no badge justifies murder, that no lie can bury the truth. For Michael, for his family, for every life this system has failed, choose accountability. Choose justice. As she sat, the weight of her words lingered. A challenge to the jury and a warning to the powerful. The cost of corruption would no longer go unanswered. Outside, the world waited, teetering between chaos and hope, as the Carters stood united, their fight a beacon against the darkness. The air in the courtroom hung heavy with grief as Amanda Carter stood, her trembling hands gripping the edges of the podium, her voice steady despite the storm raging within her. She thought of Michael, her Michael whose laughter once filled their home, whose bright eyes sparkled with dreams of a future he'd never lived to see. Parker's actions had ripped that away forever. The family would never watch him stride across a stage in a cap and gown, never hear his infectious chuckle echo through the house, never witness the man he might have grown into. To Amanda, this wasn't just a fleeting lapse in judgment. It was a deliberate act, a crime cloaked in the guise of duty. She turned sharply, her gaze locking onto the juror 12 strangers who held the power to define justice in this moment. Your decision won't bring my son back, she said, her words cutting through the silence like a blade. But it can scream to the world that choices carry weight, that prejudice isn't a free pass, And that justice isn't some hollow phrase scribbled in a textbook. It's a living, breathing promise. I begged you'll make Officer Parker answer for what he's done. Her chest heaved as she stepped back to her seat, the echo of her plea lingering like a ghost in the room, her heart pounding with the faint hope that Michael's life might still mean something. Across the aisle, Peter Lawson rose with the slow grace of a man who'd faced 100 such battles. His movements were deliberate, his polished shoes clicking softly against the hardwood floor as he adjusted his tie. With a practiced flick of his fingers, he approached the jury, his voice a low rumble, calm and measured, as if he were reasoning with old friends over coffee. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, pausing to let his words settle. "What unfolded that night was a heartbreak, a young life snuffed out too soon. My client, Officer John Parker, will carry that weight like a stone in his chest for as long as he lives," Lawson paced, his hands clasped behind his back, his eyes occasionally flicking toward the jurors to gauge their reactions. He painted the scene vividly, a lone officer stepping into the shadows, responding to a call about a suspicious figure lurking in the night. The street lamp flickered overhead, casting jagged shadows across the pavement. The air crackled with uncertainty. He was alone, Lawson continued, facing a split-second choice, life or death, his or someone else's. He believed, in that heartbeat of chaos, that danger loomed. Right or wrong, he acted to shield himself, to safeguard the very people he swore to protect. Lawson halted mid-step, pivoting to face the jury squarely. "I'm not asking you to erase what happened," he said, his tone softening, almost pleading. "I'm asking you to see it for what it was, a tragedy born of pressure, not malice. Look at my client." He gestured toward Parker, who sat hunched at the defense table. His broad shoulders slumped, his face a mask of quiet despair. "This is a man who's spent years serving this city, throwing himself into harm's way for strangers. Does that sound like a cold-blooded killer? He didn't rise that morning plotting to destroy a life. It was a mistake, a horrific, irreversible mistake, but not a crime." Lawson let the silence stretch, his eyes sweeping over the jurors one last time. "The law calls for justice, not revenge. I ask you to weigh the evidence with clear heads, not heavy hearts." The judge's instructions came next, her voice a steady drone as she outlined the jury's duty. Then, with a curt nod, she sent them off to deliberate. The courtroom seemed to hold its breath as the jurors shuffled out, their footsteps muffled by the thick carpet, tension coiled tight in the air, an electric current buzzing through the gallery. The Carter family of it, Helena, and their daughter Maya sat in a tight knot, their hands locked together, fingers white-knuckled with strain. David's jaw clenched as he stared at the empty jury box, his mind replaying every moment of Michael's life, from his first wobbly steps to his last quiet goodnight. Helena's eyes glistened, her breath shallow as she fought to hold herself together, her thoughts a tangle of grief and fury. Beside them, Maya sat rigid, her youthful face etched with a sorrow too deep for her 19 years, her fingers twisting the hem of her sweater as she silently begged for some shred of closure. Hours crawled by, each tick of the clock a hammer blow to the family's fragile hope. The gallery remained packed, reporters hunched over laptops, their fingers flying across keyboards, capturing every whisper and glance. Outside, the chants of protesters swelled, their voices a rhythmic roar that seeped through the courthouse walls. Justice for Michael. Justice now. The sound was a lifeline to the Carters, a reminder that their pain wasn't theirs alone. Finally, the jury returned, their faces unreadable as they settled into their seats. The room stood as one, a collective breath held. Judge Grant, her expression carved from stone, turned to the four-persona middle-aged woman with tired eyes and a steady hand. As the jury reached a verdict, she asked, "Yes, Your Honor," came the reply, the foreperson's voice firm as she passed a folded slip of paper to the bailiff. The judge unfolded it, her lips moving silently as she read, then lifted her gaze to the courtroom. "In the matter of the people versus John Parker," she intoned, "we, the jury, find the defendant guilty of second-degree murder." A gasp tore through the room, a sharp, ragged sound that splintered into a wave of murmurs. The judge's gavel crashed down, demanding order, but the noise only grew, shock, relief, disbelief colliding in a chaotic symphony. At the defense table, Parker seemed to collapse inward, his face draining of color, his eyes staring blankly at the table as if the world had slipped out from under him. Lawson rested a hand on his shoulder, a futile gesture of comfort. Parker didn't even flinch. Across the room, David Carter let out a shuddering breath, tears carving tracks down his weathered cheeks as he squeezed Helena's hand so tightly she winced. Helena, her composure shattered, buried her face in her hands, her sobs muffled but piercing. Maya's hands flew to her mouth, her wide eyes brimming as she whispered Michael's name under her breath, a prayer and a promise all at once. David turned to Amanda, his voice a raw, broken whisper. "Thank you," she nodded, her own tears threatening to spill, her heart swelling with the bittersweet knowledge that this was for Michael, her nephew, her light. Outside, the courthouse steps erupted into chaos as word of the verdict spread like wildfire. Protesters cheered, their voices rising in a triumphant crescendo, arms thrown around one another in tearful embraces. "Justice for Michael," they shouted, the chant rolling through the streets like thunder. But not everyone rejoiced. Counter-protesters surged forward, their faces twisted with anger, hurling accusations of bias and betrayal. The jury caved. "This is a witch hunt." Police officers formed a tense line between the groups, their hands hovering near their batons as the air crackled with the threat of violence. David, Helena, and Maya stepped into the fray, blinking against the blinding flash of cameras. Reporters swarmed, microphones thrust forward, but David raised a hand, his presence commanding silence. "This verdict doesn't bring my son back," he said, his voice steady despite the tremor in his chest. "But it's a step toward holding people accountable, toward justice not just for Michael, but for every soul lost to senseless brutality." He paused, his gaze sweeping the crowd, taking in the sea of face some tear-streaked, some defiant. "Our fight's not done. This system's still cracked and bleeding. Too many Michaels have been taken. Too many families left broken. We'll keep pushing for change, for truth, for justice." The crowd roared, their voices a tidal wave of resolve, drowning out the dissent. Inside, Parker was led away, his wrists bound in cold steel, his steps slow and leaden. As he passed the gallery, his eyes flicked up, meeting David's for a fleeting second. There was no hatred in David's stare, only a quiet, unshakable determination, a father's vow carved in stone. The verdict wasn't just a legal ruling, it was a spark that ignited a blaze far beyond these walls. What started as one family's desperate plea for their son grew into a nationwide cry, a movement shaking the foundations of power and privilege. Maya took that spark and fanned it into a flame, standing before a packed auditorium months later, her hands trembling as they gripped the podium. "My brother was 19, she said, her voice cutting through the hushed room, unarmed, peaceful, innocent, but someone decided he didn't deserve to live. And it's not just Michael. There are too many names, too many families like mine, too many lives stolen by fear and a system that shields the guilty." The audience seektivists, leaders, mourners erupted, their applause a thunderclap of shared pain and purpose. Maya pressed on, her voice cracking but fierce. "We can't resurrect Michael, but we can fight so no one else has to bury a brother, a child, a friend. We're demanding accountability. We're demanding change. And we won't stop until this broken machine is torn down and rebuilt." David, meanwhile, carried the fight to the halls of power, sitting across from lawmakers in a congressional office thick with tension. "The system didn't just fail Michael," he said, his voice low but unyielding. "It sheltered the man who took him. 12 complaints against Parker, 12 chances to stop Hyman. Nothing. That's not one rogue cop, that's a diseased root choking the whole tree." A congresswoman leaned forward, her brow creased with concern. "We've tried accountability bills, Mr. Carter. The unions fight tooth and nail. The opposition calls it anti-police." David's eyes locked onto hers, unflinching. "This isn't anti-policites, pro-life, pro-justice. If it's radical to demand consequences for those who wield lethal power, that's proof of how rotten things are. The Michael Carter Act, mandatory cameras, independent probes, civilian oversight. Stiffer penalties became their weapon, sparking rallies and rage, hope and division." At one protest, Maya stood tall on a stage, fist raised, her voice a clarion call. This is bigger than Michaelites for every name we've marched for. Every life crushed by a system that wasn't made for us. No one's above the law. Counter-protesters shouted back the blue. Their voices a discordant snarl, but Maya turned to them, unflinching. We're not against cops, we're against abuse. If you can't see the difference, you're the problem. The crowd's cheers swallowed the opposition. A testament to a truth Parker's conviction laid bare. Justice isn't just a verdict, it's a reckoning. A lesson in the cost of power unchecked. In the shadows, far from the public eye, a determined coalition of counter-protest-responsive lawmakers and influential police unions worked relentlessly to dismantle the fragile framework of the proposed legislation. Their efforts were a quiet storm, brewing with calculated precision to protect the status quo. Meanwhile, the nation's attention was drawn to a televised debate, a fiery clash of ideals broadcast into living rooms across the country. A spokesperson from the National Police Association stood at the podium, his voice booming with conviction as he jabbed a finger toward the camera. "This bill will shackle our officers," he declared, his words dripping with urgency. "It'll strip them of the ability to act decisively, to safeguard the very communities they've sworn to serve. We're talking about lives here, ours and yours." His face was flushed, his stance rigid, as if the weight of every badge rested on his shoulders. Across the stage, Amanda Green, a fierce advocate who had aligned herself with the Carter family's cause, didn't flinch. She stepped forward, her sharp gaze cutting through the rhetoric like a blade. "What this bill actually does," she countered, her tone edged with a quiet fury, "is demand that those who misuse their authority face real consequences. If you think being held accountable for your actions makes your job tougher, then maybe you don't belong behind that badge." Her words landed like a thunderclap, reverberating through the studio and beyond. The debate spiraled into a chaotic exchange of accusations and defenses. But Amanda's piercing statement lingered, rippling across social media feeds and news headlines. It was a rallying cry for those who believed justice wasn't just a privilege for the powerful, it was a right for all. David and Maya Carter, the grieving parents at the heart of this storm, carried their son Michael's story across the country like a torch. They stood before crowded town halls and community gatherings, their voices steady despite the ache that never left their chests. In one sweltering auditorium, a local sheriff rose during a Q&A session, his weathered face creased with indignation. "You're painting officers as villains," he snapped, his hands trembling slightly as he gripped the microphone. "We risk our lives every day. Do you have any idea how fast we have to decide? How much pressure we're under?" The room buzzed with tension, eyes darting between the sheriff and David. But David didn't waver. He met the man's gaze, his voice low but unyielding. "I know what it's like to dig a grave for my son because of one of those split-second decisions. I know that if men like John Parker, the officer who took Michael from Ush, had been held to account for their past, my boy would still be breathing." Accountability doesn't weaken good policing. It builds trust. It makes it better. The sheriff's jaw tightened, but no rebuttal came. The silence that followed was heavy. A collective breath held as the weight of David's loss settled over the crowd. As the Michael Carter Act inched through legislative committees, the pressure mounted like a gathering storm. Outside the Capitol, protesters swarmed the steps, their voices rising in a unified chant that echoed off the stone walls. Handmade signs bobbed above the sea of faces, bold letters proclaiming "Pass the Michael Carter Act." Speakers took turns at a makeshift podium, their words crackling with raw emotion. Inside, lawmakers clashed with equal ferocity. Conservative representatives leaned into their microphones, arguing that the bill's reach was too broad, a dangerous overstep that would cripple law enforcement. Progressives fired back, their voices trembling with urgency. "We can't keep pretending the system isn't broken," one congresswoman insisted, her hands slamming the desk for emphasis. "How many more families have to mourn? How many more names do we carve into this endless list before we say enough?" From the gallery above, David and Maya watched, their hearts pounding in sync with the debate. Maya's fists tightened until her knuckles whitened, her whisper barely audible over the din. "They're trying to tear it apart." David rested a steady hand on her shoulder, his touch a silent promise. "We've fought too hard to let them win now. Stay strong." In the final days before the vote, the Carters joined a colossal march in Washington, D.C. The streets swelled with thousands, a river of humanity flowing toward the Capitol, their voices blending into a single, unstoppable demand for change. Maya strode at the forefront, her chin lifted defiantly as she clutched a sign that read, "Michael's life mattered." Her legs ached, but her resolve burned brighter with every step. When they reached the Capitol steps, David took the microphone, his voice rising above the roar of the crowd. "This isn't just about one family or one name," he said, his eyes sweeping over the sea of upturned faces. "It's about forging a future where no one trembles at the sight of those meant to protect them. It's about justice, and not just for Michael, but for every soul stolen by a system that's failed too long. We won't rest until it's done." The crowd erupted, their cheers shaking the ground, a sound that seemed to rattle the very pillars of power. Back at the Carter home, the fight had turned their once quiet space into a bustling nerve center. Activists huddled over laptops, legal advisors scribbled notes, and reporters lingered at the doorstep, hungry for the next soundbite. But beneath the momentum, cracks were forming. Late one evening, Maya slumped in the living room corner, her phone casting a harsh glow on her weary face. Her thumb flicked through a torrent of venomous comments, accusations that she was a fraud, that Michael was a criminal, that they were exploiting his death for fame. "Look at this," she muttered, thrusting the phone toward David with a trembling hand. "They're calling me a liar, saying I'm profiting off him." David glanced at the screen, his expression darkening, but he didn't take it. "Don't let them under your skin," he said softly. "They're trying to break us, to make us question everything we're doing." Maya's eyes flashed with frustration. "That's easy for you to say. You're not the one getting death threats every time you open your mouth. People telling me they hope I end up like him. Do you know what that feels like?" Across the room, Helena Family's Rock, though she rarely spoke up, set down her coffee mug with a sigh that carried years of exhaustion. "Maybe it's time to pull back, Maya," she suggested, her voice gentle but firm. "Just for a little while, to breathe." Maya's head snapped up, disbelief etched into every line of her face. Pull back? Michael didn't get to pull back. He didn't get a choice. "Why should I?" David leaned forward, his tone steady but insistent. "No one's saying to stop fighting, but you don't have to shoulder it all by yourself." Maya shot to her feet, her chair scraping harshly against the floor. "I'm not doing this alone. I'm doing it for him. Because someone has to." She stormed out, the door slamming behind her with a force that rattled the walls. Later that night, David found her on the front porch, curled into herself, arms wrapped tightly around her knees. The air was cool, thick with the weight of their shared grief. He settled beside her, the silence stretching until he broke it. "I know this is tearing you apart," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You're carrying more than anyone should." Maya stared into the darkness, her eyes glistening. "It's not enough. No matter how loud I scream, it'll never be enough to bring him back." David's hand found her shoulder, warm and grounding. "It's not about bringing him back, it's about making sure his life mattered. And you're doing that, Maya. Every word you say, every time you stand up, it's changing something." Her voice broke, a raw edge cutting through. "I'm so tired, Dad." He pulled her close, his arms a fortress against the world. "I know. But we're together in this. You're not alone." The next morning, the fight crashed back into their lives with brutal clarity. Helena flung open the front door and froze, her shout piercing the quiet. "David! Maya!" They rushed outside, stopping short at the sight of their family car, its hood defaced with jagged red spray paint spelling "Get Out." Maya's fists balled at her sides, her breath hitching. "They think this will stop us." David circled the car, his jaw clenched as he traced the letters with his eyes. "It's not about fear, it's about shutting us up." Helena stood with her arms crossed, pale but resolute. "So what now?" David turned to them, his gaze unwavering. "We keep going. They want us to vanish, but we'll shout louder instead." Hours later, Amanda Green arrived, her briefcase thumping onto the living room table as she surveyed the family's strained faces. "Rough morning?" she asked, nodding toward the car visible through the window. David's lips pressed into a thin line. "They're desperate." Amanda's brow furrowed. "Desperation makes people dangerous. Watch yourselves." Maya stepped forward, her voice steel. "We're not stopping." Amanda gave a small, approving nod. Good. Because the opposition's doubling down. Police unions are staging rallies, and some lawmakers are buckling. They're claiming it'll paralyze law enforcement. David crossed his arms, scoffing. Paralyze them. Maybe they should think twice before shooting unarmed kids. Amanda's lips twitched into a faint smile. That's our angle. But brace yourself as it's going to get messy. That evening, the Carters joined a virtual town hall, connecting with supporters nationwide. Maya hesitated, her finger hovering over the camera button, the vandalism still gnawing at her nerves. When the moderator introduced her, she took a shaky breath and spoke. I'm Maya Carter, and I'm here because my brother can't be. Michael was 19 when he was ripped away from us. Every day, I wonder why his life didn't matter enough. Why the system shields the officer who killed him. The Michael Carter Act isn't about punishing police, it's about protecting people like him. It's about a world where justice isn't a luxury for the few. This fight's exhausting, but we can't stop, not for Michael, not for anyone we've lost. The chat exploded with encouragement, and for a moment, hope flickered through her fatigue. But not every encounter lifted her spirits. At a community meeting the next day, a retired officer leapt to his feet, his voice a furious growl. You think this bill fixes anything? It'll just chain us up and paint targets on our backs. David met his anger with calm resolve. If your job means you can't answer for what you do, maybe it's not the job for you. The man sneered, leaning closer. You're no hero, you're just making life hell for good cops. Beside David, Amanda watched the exchange, her presence a quiet pillar of strength as the room simmered with unease. The nation now waits, its pulse quickening, as Congress nears a vote on the Michael Carter Act, a decision that could redefine justice or entrench the failures of a flawed system. For the Carters, every moment is a lesson in the cost of power unchecked, and the enduring hope that accountability can light the way forward. The air in the congressional meeting room buzzed with an electric hum, a blend of hope and unease swirling among the attendees. David Carter's voice cut through the murmur like a steady blade, his words deliberate and firm. Good cops don't shrink from accountability, embrace it with open arms. This bill isn't a weapon aimed at officers, it's a shield for our communities, a bridge to mend the trust that's been fractured for far too long. His dark eyes scanned the room, meeting nods of approval from some, while others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The faint hum of agreement rippled through the space, yet a taut thread of tension hung heavy, unspoken doubts lingering like shadows in the corners. That evening, the Carter family gathered around their worn oak dining table, the warm glow of a single lamp casting soft light over their faces. The clink of forks against plates filled the silence until Maya's voice broke through, soft and hesitant. I'm sorry for snapping at you earlier, she said, her gaze dropping to her hands, fingers twisting nervously around her napkin. Her apology carried the weight of exhaustion. Her shoulders slumped from days of relentless pressure. David looked at her, his stern features softening as he nodded slowly. We're all stretched thin, Maya. This fight, it's a beast that tests us, but we can't let it tear us apart. Across the table, Helena reached out, her hands trembling slightly as she grasped both of theirs, her touch warm and grounding. No matter what storms come, we hold tight to each other. That's our strength, our only way through this darkness. Maya's lips curved into a fragile smile. A flicker of light piercing the weariness etched into her face, and for a moment, the room felt a little less heavy. Days later, the halls of Congress thrummed with a restless energy, the walls practically vibrating as the final votes for the Michael Carter Act were tallied. Lawmakers huddled in tight knots, their whispers a symphony of anticipation, frustration, and quiet hope. Some paced, their polished shoes clicking against the marble floor, while others leaned against the ornate walls, brows furrowed in thought. Beyond the Capitol's towering doors, the streets swelled with thousands of protesters, their voices rising in a powerful chorus that shook the urchins of justice now, blending with the rustle of signs, proclaiming reform or bust. Inside, high in the gallery overlooking the chamber, David sat flanked by Helena and Maya. Helena's fingers gripped his arm, her knuckles pale, while Maya sat rigid, her breath shallow. Beside them, Amanda Green stood like a sentinel, arms crossed tightly over her chest, her sharp eyes locked on the scene unfolding below. Every muscle in her body seemed coiled, as if she could will the outcome through sheer force of determination. The Speaker of the House rose, her presence commanding as the gavel struck the podium with a resounding crack that echoed through the vast room. The results of the vote on the Michael Carter Act are as follows: 229 yeas, 206 nays. The bill passes. For a heartbeat, the chamber froze, the air thick with disbelief. Then the gallery exploded cheers and applause cascaded down like a wave, filling every corner. Helena's grip tightened on David's arm as tears carved silent paths down her cheeks, her chest heaving with sobs she couldn't contain. Maya's hands flew to her face, her shoulders shaking as relief flooded through her, overwhelming and raw. David rose to his feet, his tall frame steady despite the storm of emotion swirling within him. His eyes glistened, but his jaw remained set, resolute. "This is for you, Michael," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the uproar. A sacred promise carried on the breath of victory. That night, the streets outside the Capitol transformed into a living tapestry of celebration. Strangers embraced under a sky streaked with the golden hues of dusk, their laughter and songs weaving together beneath banners that fluttered proudly justice for Michael. And change is here. On a rickety makeshift stage, Maya stepped forward, her figure small, but her presence towering. The crowd hushed, then roared as her voice rang out, clear and fierce. "This victory isn't just ours alone. It belongs to every family who's ever felt the sting of loss, every soul silenced by injustice. We've taken a step forward today, but the road stretches on. Together, we've shown what's possible and we march on, unyielding." The crowd erupted, their cheers a thunderous echo that rolled into the night, a testament to their shared resolve. A week later, the Carter family stood on the cracked asphalt of Michael's favorite basketball court, now reborn as a sacred space. Volunteers had poured their hearts into the transformation days spent brushing vibrant colors across the towering wall, crafting a mural of Michael that seemed to breathe with life. His wide grin, the one that lit up every game he played, gazed down on them, eternal reminder of the joy he'd brought to this place. The community gathered for the dedication, a sea of face neighbors with weathered smiles, friends wiping away tears, activists standing tall with quiet pride. Children darted across the freshly painted court, their laughter mingling with the soft hum of a warm breeze. Speakers took turns at a small podium, their words painting Michael's legacy in hues of courage and love. Amanda Green stepped up, her voice steady but thick with emotion. "Michael's story didn't end when we lost him, it ignited something greater. This court, this mural, this movement fireproof his life mattered. That his spirit still stirs us to fight for what's right." She paused, stepping back, her eyes lingering on the mural as if she could see him there, cheering her on. David followed, his broad shoulders squared as he faced the crowd. He stood silent for a long moment, staring at the mural, the lines of his son's face etched into his memory. "Michael loved this game," he began, his voice low but unwavering, carrying the weight of a father's grief and pride. "He loved this community, these streets, these people. Though he's gone, I feel him in every step we've taken since that awful day. This bill, this movement, this plaisir are vow to him. We promised justice wouldn't be a rare gift, but a foundation we build together." Helena and Maya joined him, their hands linking with his, a quiet strength flowing between them as the crowd's applause rose like a tide, washing over them in waves. As the ceremony stretched on, reporters swarmed David, their microphones thrust forward, voices overlapping with eager questions. He raised a hand, his refusal polite but firm, and slipped away to the court's edge. There he stood alone, watching children chase a basketball across the pavement, their shouts of glee piercing the air. Maya drifted to his side, her steps soft against the asphalt. "Do you think Michael would have liked this?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper, her eyes tracing the same path as his. David's lips curved into a faint, bittersweet smile. "He'd have loved it, Maya. But more than that, he'd have loved being here, playing with them." Her eyes shimmered with unshed tears as she nodded. "I miss him so much." David's hand found her shoulder, steady and warm. "I do too. I always will. But we're giving his life meaning, making sure it echoes beyond that day. That's what counts." Later that night, the family gathered in their living room, the dim light casting long shadows across the walls. The triumph they'd fought for sat heavy beside the ache that never left. A quiet companion to their victory, Helena broke the stillness, her voice soft but firm. "This is just the beginning, isn't it?" David nodded, his gaze distant yet determined. "There's a mountain of work ahead. A law's a start, but it doesn't unravel a system in a day." Maya leaned forward, her exhaustion giving way to fire. "Then we keep pushing for Michael, for every name still waiting to be heard." David met her eyes, pride glowing in his expression like a beacon. "We will, Maya, we will." Across town, in the early morning light, Mrs. Dorothy Washington stepped carefully onto the cracked sidewalk outside her modest home. At 78, her movements carried the grace of a lifetime spent guiding young minds. Her silver hair swept into a neat bun, her purple dress a gift from her late husband James shugging her frame. The air was crisp, the sun stretching long shadows as she began her weekly trek to Carter's Market. She'd walked these 3 blocks for over 50 years, watching the neighborhood bloom and fade around her. Once a tiny corner store, Carter's had grown under Mr. Carter Sr.'s hands into a bustling hub, a heartbeat of the community she'd woven herself into. Along the way, the world stirred awake. Mrs. Rodriguez waved from her garden, her roses glistening with dew, while the Lopez kids shouted, "Good morning, Mrs. Washington," from the bus stop, their voices echoing the greetings of their parents decades before. These threads of connection warmed Dorothy's heart, reminders that though her classroom days were long past, she remained a cornerstone here. Tuesday was her grocery dia ritual carved over 32 Yershison for the quiet aisles. And fresh produce, her list, scrawled neatly on an old envelope, reflected the lessons she'd taught her students. Waste not, want not. Inside Carter's, the cool air greeted her like an old friend, the hum of fluorescent lights blending with the scent of fresh bread. Young Tommy, the bagger with a grin as bright as the sun, rolled out her favorite cart, the one with smooth wheels he always saved for her. "Good morning, Mrs. Washington," he called, his kindness a small gift she cherished. She moved through the store with purpose, her fingers testing the firmness of tomatoes, her eyes scanning the greens for her church potluck collards. Maria, the produce manager, beamed as Dorothy asked after her grandson Marcus. "An A on his history test," Maria exclaimed, and Dorothy's chest swelled with pride. As if he were her own, the aisles buzzed with familiar faces. Chen gathering spices for his restaurant, Mrs. Patterson seeking pie advice, young Sarah darting through with her med school haste. Each encounter deepened the story of this place, a tapestry of lives intersecting under Dorothy's quiet gaze. She saw Michael's mural in her mind's eye, a symbol of justice rising from pain. And it struck her, power unchecked could shatter, but accountability could heal. The Carter's fight and her own small act wove a lesson into the world. Justice wasn't just a law, but a promise kept, a legacy built, a community held close. Dorothy Washington stretched her arm toward the middle shelf, her fingers brushing against a can of beans when a faint ache rippled through her lower back. It was a familiar twinge, one she'd grown accustomed to after years of standing in classrooms and tending to her garden, but it still caught her off guard. She paused, her gray curls catching the soft glow of the morning light streaming through Carter's Markets. Wide front windows. The store was alive, with its usual rhythm hum of gentle music drifting from overhead speakers, the squeak of cart wheels against the polished floor, and the occasional clatter of cans being stacked. Dorothy exhaled slowly, savoring the peace of this Tuesday ritual. She loved these moments, surrounded by familiar faces who greeted her with warm smiles and small talk about her studies or the weather. Nearby, David Henderson, the store manager, knelt beside a display of canned goods, his hands deftly arranging the rows with care. He'd been at Carter's for over a decade, his sandy hair now streaked with hints of gray, but his energy remained youthful. Spotting Dorothy's slight struggle, he rose without a second thought and crossed the aisle in a few quick strides. "Let me get that for you, Mrs. Washington," he said, his voice carrying a genuine warmth that made her feel seen. He reached up effortlessly, retrieving the can and placing it in her weathered hands. "And don't forget," he added with a grin, "we've got your favorite peach preserves on sale today." I set a jar aside just for you knew you'd want it. Dorothy's lips curved into a grateful smile, her eyes crinkling at the corners. David's thoughtfulness was a small but steady comfort, a reminder of the community she'd woven herself into over the years. Her shopping basket was a testament to her life's quiet purpose. Each item she selected carried intention, flour and spices for the hearty meals she cooked every week, little bags of candy for the neighborhood children who still tumbled onto her porch after school with their laughter and muddy shoes, and extra supplies for the care packages she assembled for elderly neighbors, too frail to venture out. As she moved through the aisles, the sunlight danced across the floor in shifting patterns, casting a golden hue over her purple dress, a garment she'd worn countless times during her teaching days, its fabric soft and faded, but still holding an air of dignity. This was her sanctuary, a place where routine wrapped around her like a warm blanket. But as she stood there, inspecting a bunch of ripe bananas, their yellow skins speckled with brown, the air in Carter's market began to shift. The change was subtle at first, a slight dimming of the music, as if someone had turned the volume down just a notch. Then came the sound of heavy boots thudding against the tile, deliberate and out of place in the produce section's usual calm. Dorothy's fingers tightened around the bananas as she glanced up, her heart giving a small, unsteady lurch. Two police officers approached, their badges glinting sharply under the store's fluorescent lights. Officer Jensen towered over the aisles, his frame rigid and imposing, his hand resting casually on his belt as though it belonged there. Officer Murphy, shorter but broad-shouldered, clutched a clipboard that seemed oddly formal, his face set in a grim line. Neither offered a smile, their expressions carved from stone as they closed the distance. Dorothy's mind raced, but she kept her movements slow and deliberate, placing the bananas back on the display. Surely they were here for someone else, perhaps a shoplifter or a disturbance in another aisle. She smoothed the front of her dress, a nervous habit from years of facing restless students, and turned her attention back to her shopping. "Ma'am," Officer Jensen's voice cut through the air like a blade, sharp and unyielding. "We need you to step away from the produce." Dorothy flinched, her breath catching as her hands trembled faintly. Around her, the store seemed to freeze. Shoppers paused their carts, their eyes darting toward the unfolding scene, curiosity and unease rippling through the crowd. "Is something wrong, officer?" she asked, her voice soft but steady, a thread of steel running beneath it. Her heart pounded against her ribcage, a frantic drumbeat she couldn't quiet. But she refused to let it show. She straightened her posture, her chin lifting slightly as she met Jensen's gaze. Officer Murphy flipped through his clipboard, his movements jerky and mechanical. "We received a report of suspicious behavior in this area," he said, his tone flat and rehearsed. "Someone matching your description has been observed handling multiple items without purchasing them." The words landed like a punch, knocking the air from Dorothy's lungs. Her chest tightened, a mix of disbelief and dread swirling within her. For over 30 years, she'd shopped here every Tuesday, her hands carefully choosing each item with the same care she'd once used to grade papers. The accusation was absurd, laughable even if it weren't so terrifying. David Henderson, who'd been assisting a customer near the bread aisle, caught the rising tension and hurried over, his brow furrowed with concern. "Officers, there must be some mistake," he said, positioning himself between them and Dorothy like a shield. His voice was firm but respectful, a plea wrapped in authority. "Mrs. Washington is one of our most valued customers. She's been coming here every Tuesday for longer than I've been manager, probably longer than I've been alive." Officer Jensen raised a hand, cutting him off with a dismissive wave. "Sir, please step back. This is a police matter," he barked, his voice echoing through the store, drawing more eyes. Young Tommy, the bagger, peered out from behind a tower of shopping baskets, his knuckles white as he gripped the plastic handles. His wide eyes flickered between Dorothy and the officers, confusion etched across his freckled face. He'd only been working at Carter's for a few months, but he knew Dorothy's gentle smile and the way she always thanked him for carrying her bags. "I'm just doing my shopping," Dorothy explained, her voice trembling ever so slightly, a crack in her calm facade. She reached into her purse, intending to pull out her neatly handwritten shopping list as proof of her intent. But Officer Murphy's hand snapped to his holster. "Keep your hands where we can see them," he snapped, his tone sharp enough to make nearby shoppers gasp. Dorothy froze, her dignity a fragile shield as she slowly raised her hands. Tears prickled at the corners of her eyes, but she blinked them back, refusing to let them fall. The humiliation stung, a bitter reminder of moments from her youth moments she'd buried deep, hoping they'd never resurface. Maria, the produce manager, stepped forward, her apron streaked with dirt from handling greens all morning. She was a sturdy woman with a no-nonsense air, her dark hair pulled back in a tight bun. "I've been helping Mrs. Washington pick out collard greens for the church potluck," she said, her voice ringing with conviction. "She's done nothing wrong." Her words hung in the air, a lifeline thrown into the chaos. More customers began to drift closer, abandoning their carts at the ends of nearby aisles. Mrs. Patterson, a weary woman with silver hair, fumbled with her phone, her fingers trembling as she started recording. Mr. Chen, a quiet man who owned the local dry cleaners, edged forward, his cart forgotten, his usually reserved demeanor replaced by a flicker of resolve. The officers bristled at the growing attention. "Everyone needs to mind their own business and step back," Officer Jensen bellowed, his voice booming over the buzz of the fluorescent lights. "This is an official investigation," but the crowd didn't retreat. Dorothy stood still, her mind spinning back to the injustices of her pastimes when she'd faced stern faces and cold accusations, times she'd prayed were gone forever. Yet something felt different now. The air crackled with a new energy, a collective pulse she could feel in the way her fellow shoppers refused to look away. Sarah, a medical student still wearing her hospital ID badge from an overnight shift, pushed through the gathering throng. Her dark eyes flashed with determination as she planted herself beside Dorothy. "I'm staying right here," she said, her voice low but unshakable. The tension thickened, the hum of the lights overhead a constant drone as Dorothy's cart sat abandoned nearby, her carefully chosen groceries a silent witness to the morning's unraveling. Officer Murphy muttered into his radio, calling for backup, while Jensen continued to demand space, his face reddening with each passing second. But the crowd only swelled, their phones out, their expressions a mix of worry and defiance. This wasn't just about Dorothy anymore, it was a reckoning, a stand against something larger, something that had simmered beneath the surface for too long. The next few minutes unfolded like a slow-motion drama, each second heavy with meaning. James Miller, the burly owner of the hardware store down the street, had only stopped in for a gallon of milk. Now he stood among the circle of supporters, his deep voice cutting through the murmurs. "This is completely unacceptable," he declared, loud enough for the entire store to hear. He'd known Dorothy since she'd taught his kids, her lessons sparking their love for books, a gift he'd never forgotten. Maria Rodriguez, still in her nurse's scrubs from a grueling night shift, knelt beside Dorothy, her gentle hands pulling a chair from the customer service desk. "Mrs. Washington, please sit," she urged softly. "Your blood pressure, let's not take chances." She'd seen too many patients crumble under stress, and the tightness in Dorothy's shoulders set off every alarm in her mind. The officers shifted uneasily, their authority fraying as more phones captured their every move. Jensen's face flushed a deeper red, his jaw tight, while Murphy clutched his clipboard like a shield, his eyes darting nervously. Backup was still minutes away, and the store was transforming into a battlefield of wills. Kevin Williams, a lanky teenager who often helped Dorothy carry her groceries, shoved his way forward, his voice cracking with indignation. "Mrs. Washington gives me cookies every Tuesday," he shouted. "She's the nicest person in the whole neighborhood." His mother tugged at his arm, but his words lingered, a child's truth piercing the tension. Sarah Chen, the medical student, held her phone steady, live streaming to her followers. "I want everyone to see how our community protects its own," she said, her voice clear and unwavering. "Mrs. Washington has lived here for 50 years. She volunteers at the hospital, helps everyone, and this is how she's treated while buying groceries." David Henderson returned from a hurried call with the store's owner, Mr. Carter Jr., his eyes blazing with resolve. Mr. Carter says if anyone should leave. It's not Mrs. Washington, he announced. She's been shopping here since his father ran this place. Dorothy sank into the chair, her hands folded in her lap, the same patient posture she'd used to guide generations of students. Tears finally slipped down her cheeks, not from fear, but from the overwhelming wave of support enveloping her. Mrs. Patterson lowered her phone for a moment, her voice trembling as she spoke. "My mother faced the same treatment in the 60s, she said, her eyes glistening. "I never thought I'd see it in 2025, but I never imagined this kind of unity either." The crowd was a tapestry of faces. Lee from the dry cleaners, Miss Thompson from the bank, the high school football coach beside a former student now driving a city bus. They linked arms, forming a human chain that stretched across the store, unbreakable and fierce. Outside, police cars screeched into the parking lot, their lights flashing through the windows. But the scene inside was shifting. Two local residents, alerted by the buzz on social media, parked their cars and streamed through the doors. Elderly Mrs. Jen, her hands shaky as she gripped her phone, muttered, "My grandson showed me how to do this. The whole world needs to see what happens when you mess with one of our own." The officers' radios crackled with frantic questions from their superiors, but the answers were already written in the faces of the people surrounding Dorothy. This wasn't just a confrontation, it was a lesson carved in real time, a testament to the cost of power wielded without care. Dorothy's trembling hands and steady gaze spoke of a justice long deferred, while the crowd's defiance roared of consequences that would echo far beyond these walls. Carter's Market, once a quiet haven, had become a stage where the weight of history and the strength of community collided, leaving no one untouched. The morning sun poured through the wide windows of Carter's Market, casting golden beams across the polished linoleum floor, illuminating a scene that had spiraled far beyond anyone's expectations. What had begun as a routine call about a suspicious person had erupted into something uncontainably, a chaotic symphony of voices, emotions, and a community's unyielding spirit. The air buzzed with tension, but also with something heavier, the weight of justice hanging in the balance, teetering between power misused and the quiet strength of those it sought to crush. Officer Jensen stood rigid, his uniform crisp but his confidence fraying at the edges. His superiors had demanded answers. We had a mundane report ballooned into a viral spectacle, splashed across social media. He shifted uncomfortably, his boots squeaking against the floor, unable to muster a response that didn't sound hollow. Beside him, Officer Murphy fumbled with his clipboard, his fingers trembling as he tried to hold onto the flimsy thread of authority that had unraveled the moment the crowd began to swell. The suspicious behavior report, a single, pitiful sheet of paper lay abandoned on the ground, its sparse details mocking the chaos it had ignited. Amid the storm of scrutiny, young Tommy, the store's bagger, moved with a quiet purpose that stood in stark contrast to the officer's unease. Barely 18, with a mop of dark hair and a lanky frame, he knelt beside Dorothy Washington's overturned grocery bags, his hands steady as he gathered her scattered items. Apples, a loaf of bread, a bag of sweet potatoes, chosen each one with care. And Tommy wasn't about to let that effort go to waste. He packed them into fresh paper bags, his brow furrowed in concentration, as if this small act could stitch together the dignity that had been torn apart in the confrontation. To him, Dorothy wasn't just a customer, she was the heartbeat of this neighborhood, and he'd be damned if she left empty-handed. Dorothy herself sat in a folding chair someone had dragged over, her thin frame draped in a faded floral dress that spoke of years of practicality and grace. Her hands rested in her lap, trembling slightly, not from fear, but from the raw sting of humiliation. She'd come to the store that morning with a simple mission: groceries for the church potluck, a tradition she'd upheld for decades. Now, her sharp brown eyes glistened with unshed tears as she replayed the officer's accusations in her mind. Suspicious, they'd called her, as if her presence in this store, her store, could ever be anything but rightful. Yet beneath her hurt simmered a quiet resolve, a steel forged over a lifetime of standing tall against worse indignities than this. The tension snapped like a taut wire when a voice, deep and resonant as a church bell, sliced through the clamor. "What in God's name is going on here? Reverend Michael Thompson strode through the entrance, his towering figure framed by the sunlight streaming behind him. His shadow stretched long and dark across the floor, a silent proclamation of his presence. At 65, his face bore the lines of a life spent fighting first on the picket lines of the civil rights era, now in the quieter but no less fierce battles of community care. He'd pulled his church van into the parking lot moments earlier, intending to grab supplies for the food bank, only to spot the flashing police lights and the growing throng of onlookers. Pressed against the windows, the room shifted the instant he stepped inside. People parted instinctively, their murmurs fading as reverence took hold. Reverend Thompson wasn't just a pastor, he was a pillar, a man whose sermons stirred souls and whose handshake carried the weight of history. Even Officer Jensen, who'd sat in the pews of Thompson's church on Sundays, straightened his spine, though his eyes betrayed a flicker of dread. "Sir," Jensen began, his voice tight, "we're conducting an official investigation." The Reverend raised a hand, cutting him off with the calm authority of someone who'd faced down far worse than a nervous cop. "An investigation of Dorothy Washington." His words rang out, clear and deliberate, filling the store like a hymn. The same Dorothy Washington who spent 20 years volunteering at our food bank every Wednesday, who tutors our kids without asking a dime, who brings soup to the sick when no one else remembers. He crossed the floor in long, purposeful strides, his worn leather shoes tapping against the tiles, until he stood beside Dorothy's chair, his large hand settled gently on her shoulder, a gesture brimming with both protection and pride. Dorothy tilted her head up to meet his gaze, her tears catching the light. "Reverend," she whispered, her voice soft but steady, a thread of gratitude woven through it. He squeezed her shoulder, a silent vow that she wouldn't face this alone, then turned back to the officers, his expression hardening. "Young man," he said, fixing Jensen with a stare that could pierce steel, "I was here when this store first opened its doors to black customers. I stood in this very aisle when Mr. Carter Sr. hired the first black cashier, and now I'm here watching you harass a woman who's done more for this community than you could ever hope to understand while she's buying groceries for our potluck." The backup officers, newly arrived and hovering uncertainly at the crowd's edge, exchanged uneasy glances. One of them, Officer Robinson, shifted his weight, his broad shoulders slumping as recognition dawned. He knew Dorothy from the community center, where she ran a reading program his two daughters adored. Every Tuesday, she'd sit with them, her voice patient and warm, coaxing words from pages they'd once found daunting. Robinson's jaw tightened as guilt crept in. He'd answered the call without a second thought, never imagining it would lead here. Reverend Thompson's voice grew louder, a crescendo of righteous indignation. "Do you know what Mrs. Washington did last month, when Officer Martinez's mother was wasting away with cancer? She didn't just pray, she organized a meal train, cooked dinner for their family twice a week, every week, without fail. That's who you're treating like a criminal today." The words landed like blows, each one stripping away the officer's veneer of justification. Sarah Chen, a nurse still in her scrubs from the morning shift, stood near the checkout, her phone trembling in her hands as she live-streamed the scene. The viewer count ticked upward 10,000 now, and climbing fast. Comments flooded in, a torrent of outrage and support from across the city. "This is disgusting. Dorothy's a legend. Protect her at all costs." Outside, news vans screeched into the parking lot, their crews scrambling to set up cameras, drawn by the digital wildfire Sarah had sparked. Officer Murphy's clipboard slipped from his sweaty grip, clattering to the floor with a sound that echoed like a gunshot. He crouched to retrieve it, his hands shaking visibly, exposing the fragility of the power he'd wielded so carelessly moments before. The crowd's eyes followed him, their phones still recording, capturing every faltering move. This wasn't just a mistake anymore, it was a reckoning. "I think," Reverend Thompson said, his tone firm as granite, "it's time you explain to your superiors why you chose to terrorize a respected elder, instead of building trust with the people you're sworn to serve. Because that's your job, isn't it? To protect and serve, and not to intimidate and divide." His words hung in the air, a challenge and a lesson rolled into one, a reminder that justice wasn't just a badge, it was a promise, A new figure shoved through the crowdless Captain Williams, his face a mask of grim resolve. Alerted by frantic calls from citizens watching Sarah's stream, he'd sped across town. His siren blaring, dread pooling in his gut as the situation crystallized. He took in the scene, Dorothy in her chair, the Reverend beside her, the officers shrinking under the weight of their own actions. Officers Jensen and Murphy. He barked, his voice cutting through the murmurs, "Step outside." Now, there was no room for debate in his tone, only the sharp edge of accountability. The officers shuffled toward the exit, heads bowed, the crowd parting silently to let them pass. Their departure felt like a collective exhale, but the phones stayed up, documenting every step. Dorothy rose from her chair, her movements slow but deliberate, her dignity unshaken despite the ordeal. She smoothed her dress with hands that no longer trembled, then turned to the Reverend. "I still need to finish my shopping," she said, her voice clear and unwavering. "Potluck's tomorrow, and those children are counting on my sweet potato pie." A ripple of laughter broke through the crowd, warm and defiant, followed by a swell of applause. Tommy stepped forward, his lanky arms cradling her repacked bags. "I made sure to pick the best sweet potatoes, Mrs. Washington," he said, his chest puffing slightly with pride. His eyes shone with admiration. Had grown up hearing stories of her kindness, and today, he'd played his own small part in her story. Captain Williams turned to Dorothy, removing his hat in a gesture of respect that felt almost ceremonial. "Mrs. Washington, on behalf of the department, I want to," but she cut him off, her tone gentle yet firm, like a teacher correcting a wayward student. "Young man, we've got a lot to talk about though your officers treat folks in this community. But first, I need to finish my shopping. Care to help me pick out some pecans for my pie? We can walk and talk. I'd like to hear your plans to make sure this never happens again." By sunset, Sarah's livestream had exploded past 1 million views, its reach stretching far beyond the city's borders. Unlike the countless videos of police clashes that flooded the internet, this one told a different Talia story of unity, of a community rising to shield one of its own with grace and grit. News trucks lined the street outside Carter's Market, their satellite dishes piercing the dusk sky. While inside Dorothy's modest home, the chaos of the day settled into something softer, stranger. She sank into her favorite armchair, its faded cushions molding to her familiar shape, as her phone rang incessantly. Bouquets of flowers and trays of food crowded her kitchen counter. Gifts from neighbors who'd seen the video and felt compelled to act. Every few minutes, a tentative knock sounded at her door. Simeon checking in, offering a hug or a word of thanks. Her granddaughter Lisa, who'd hopped a flight from Chicago after watching the footage on her office computer, sat cross-legged on the rug, scrolling through her phone. "Grandma," she said, her voice tinged with awe, "we're trending on Twitter. They're calling you grocery store grandma and community queen. People are posting about how do you help them, tutoring, lunches, everything." Dorothy shook her head, a faint smile tugging at her lips as she tried to process it all. The clips circulating online painted a mosaic of the day. Tommy meticulously repacking her groceries, Mr. Chen standing resolute with his arms crossed, and most popular of all, her final exchange with Captain Williams, calmly discussing pecans and police reform. "That's my teacher," former students wrote in the comments. "She taught me to read when I couldn't keep up. Mrs. Washington gave me lunch money when my mom lost her job." The threads wove together 35 years of quiet service, a legacy now spilling into the open. At the police station, Captain Williams convened an emergency meeting, the air thick with urgency. The department's social media accounts drowned under a deluge of messages. Some furious, others pleading for change. Calls poured in from other precincts nationwide, their leaders anxious to avoid their own versions of this mess. Reverend Thompson's phone buzzed relentlessly too. National civil rights groups clamoring for his voice, but he brushed them aside. Instead, he poured his energy into a community meeting set for the next evening at his church, a chance to harness this moment for something lasting. Back at Carter's Market, the day took an unexpected turn. Shoppers trickled in from across the city, their carts rattling as they filled them with goods, a show of solidarity with the store that had stood by Dorothy. Mr. Carter Jr., a weary man with his father's stubborn streak, seized the opportunity. He set up a donation box for the food bank Dorothy served, and within hours, it overflowed with cash and canned goods, a tangible echo of her impact. Dr. Roberts, the local high school principal, played Sarah's video during the morning assembly, his voice thick with emotion as he addressed the students. "This is what community looks like," he said, gesturing to the screen where Dorothy stood tall. "When Mrs. Washington taught here, she didn't just teach books, it taught us to stand for what's right." By nightfall, a new hashtag trended like Washington, igniting stories of neighbors banding together against injustice. A spark from Dorothy's fire spreading wide. Maria Rodriguez, a nurse who'd fretted over Dorothy's blood pressure during the standoff, launched a Facebook group called Community Guardians. Its mission was simple but profound, pairing volunteers with elderly shoppers to ensure they felt safe, seen, valued. The group swelled overnight, a network of hands reaching out where systems had failed. Tommy, still bagging groceries as the day wound down, spoke to a local reporter, his voice earnest. "The best part wasn't when the police left," he said, pausing to tuck a loaf of bread into a bag. "It was when Mrs. Washington kept shopping. She showed them she belongs, her ethic, this is her place, and no one can take that away." His words captured the heart of it, a lesson in justice, yes, but also in the consequences of power wielded without care. Dorothy's quiet insistence on finishing her errand wasn't just defiance. It was a reclaiming of what was hers, a reminder that true strength lies in the roots of a community, deep and unshakable, ready to rise when one of its own is wronged. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm golden glow across the town, Dorothy Washington sat nestled in her cozy living room. The fading light filtered through the lace curtains, illuminating the faces of her family and neighbors gathered around her. She cradled her favorite chipped teacup, the one with delicate roses painted along the rim, savoring the soothing warmth of the tea as it seeped into her tired hands. On the kitchen counter behind her, a sweet potato pea, her hard-earned triumph after days of turmoil, rested proudly, its rich aroma mingling with the chatter and laughter that filled the room. Outside, beyond the walls of her modest home, the sound of soft voices and flickering candlelight drifted through the evening air. Her former students, now grown and scattered across the community, had come together in the twilight to hold an impromptu vigil. They stood shoulder to shoulder, their candles raised high, a silent but powerful testament to the woman who had shaped their lives. What had begun as a single, ugly moment had blossomed into something far greater, a beacon of hope that shone brightly against the shadows of fear and division. Dorothy felt it deep in her bones. This was only the start of a tide that would reshape their world. The next morning broke with a crisp clarity, the sun climbing steadily into a cloudless sky. At the police department, Chief Robert Martinez stood tall before a restless crowd of reporters, his broad shoulders squared against the weight of the moment. The badges of the officers lined up behind him caught the sunlight, flashing like tiny stars. But his hands gripped the podium with a tension that betrayed his calm exterior. Camera shutters snapped like a thunderstorm rolling in, each flash illuminating the lines etched deep into his weathered face. "What happened to Mrs. Dorothy Washington yesterday?" he began, his voice cutting through the murmur of the crowd with unwavering resolve. "Is utterly unacceptable." Inside, his chest tightened as he thought of her quiet strength, her unyielding grace. Officers Jensen and Murphy have been placed on immediate administrative leave, and a thorough investigation is already underway. But let me be clear, this is only the first step. Back in her living room, Dorothy watched the press conference unfold on her small, flickering television. Her daughter Rachel sat beside her, gripping her mother's hand so tightly that Dorothy could feel the tremble in her fingers. The chief's words carried a weight Dorothy hadn't expected. No hollow excuses, no rote recitations of protocol. Instead, there was something raw, something real. "I've spoken with Mrs. Washington myself," Martinez continued, his voice catching slightly as he addressed the sea of microphones. The reporters exchanged surprised glances when he paused, brushing a tear from his cheek with the back of his hand. "This morning, I sat at her kitchen table. She welcomed me into her home, served me a slice of that sweet potato pie she'd been trying to make when this all began." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper, holding it up for the cameras to see. It was her shopping list, simple, neatly penned, and somehow still pristine despite the chaos it had endured. "This list," he said, his voice rising, "is a symbol of everything that went wrong. An elderly woman, shopping for a church potluck, treated like a threat. But it's also a promise of everything we're going to fix." At the precinct, officers clustered around television screens, their expressions a tangled mix of unease and reluctant admiration. Officer Robinson, who had arrived as backup the day before, stood with his arms crossed, his jaw tight. He couldn't shake the memory of Dorothy's reading program, how his own kids had come home with books tucked under their arms, their eyes alight with stories she'd brought to life. "Effective immediately," Chief Martinez declared, his tone leaving no room for doubt. "We're launching Project Washington. This isn't just a policy tweak, it's a complete overhaul of how we police this community. Every officer will undergo new training, but not behind a desk. They'll be out there volunteering at community centers, sitting in on neighborhood meetings, even shopping alongside the people they serve." Dorothy's phone buzzed on the coffee table, and she smiled as Reverend Thompson's voice crackled through the line. "Are you seeing this, Dorothy?" he asked, his excitement palpable. "This is change, real, honest change. Your dignity cracked open a door none of us could have dreamed of." Back at the podium, Martinez pressed on, undeterred by the flurry of questions rising from the crowd. "We're establishing a civilian oversight committee, and I've asked Mrs. Washington to chair it. She's spent decades teaching children how to be better humans. Now she'll teach us how to be better protectors." The reporters surged forward, but he raised a hand, silencing them. "There's more. Officers Jensen and Murphy have asked to meet with Mrs. Washington privately to apologize face-to-face." She agreed, but on her terms. They'll join her next week at the food bank, where she volunteers. She wants them to feel what community truly means, in her living room. Dorothy dabbed at her eyes with a crumpled tissue, her grandson Marcus kneeling beside her. He'd driven all night from Atlanta after seeing the video online, and now his hands rested gently on her shoulders. "Grandma," he whispered, his voice thick with pride, "you're turning the world upside down without even trying." The police department's social media team uploaded the full video of Martinez's speech, and within hours, phones began ringing off the hook. Departments from neighboring cities, then states, reached out, hungry to learn about Project Washington and how they might follow suit. "This isn't just about rules," Martinez said as he wrapped up, his voice swelling with conviction. "It's about rethinking what policing can be. Mrs. Washington taught kids to be good people. Now she's teaching us the same lesson. Justice isn't just a word, it's a way of living." As the cameras panned across the scene, they caught a fleeting moment, several officers in the background, their heads bowed, wiping tears from their eyes. Among them was a rookie, fresh from the academy, her uniform still stiff with newness. She'd been one of Dorothy's last students, sitting cross-legged on the classroom rug years ago, hanging on her every word. The sun climbed higher, bathing the dispersing crowd in light. But the story was far from over. It was the opening page of a new chapter, one where a community and its guardians might finally walk hand in hand. A month later, Carter's Market bore little resemblance to the quiet store it had once been on Tuesday mornings. What used to be a sleepy shopping day had transformed into a bustling celebration of connection. Senior citizens from every corner of the city streamed through the doors, their steps slow but purposeful, each paired with a volunteer from the Community Guardians program. Maria Rodriguez, a fiery young woman with a knack for organizing, had launched the initiative after witnessing Dorothy's ordeal firsthand. Now, Dorothy stood near the entrance, her bright yellow vest emblazoned with Community Guardian Coordinator in bold letters. She clutched a clipboard, her eyes scanning the list of paired shoppers young and old, from every walk of life, united in purpose. Even off-duty police officers had joined the ranks, their badges traded for aprons and smiles. "Mrs. Washington," Officer Jensen called out, waving as he approached. The incident had carved a deep wound in him, but weeks at the food bank with Dorothy had begun to heal it. Today, he guided Mrs. Chen, a tiny woman with a shy smile and halting English, through the aisles. searching for ingredients for her grandson's birthday cake. Nearby, Sarah Chen, relation, but the very student whose live stream had sparked this wildfire of change, worked in the store's community room. She'd set up a free health clinic there, her stethoscope dangling around her neck as she and her fellow medical students offered checkups to elderly shoppers. "Prevention beats cure every time," she'd say with a grin, echoing the lessons Dorothy had drilled into her back in 3rd grade. The store itself had evolved under the weight of this newfound purpose. Mr. Carter Jr., the owner, had added benches along the aisles for weary legs, installed brighter lights that chased away the shadows, and hung a community bulletin board near the entrance. It was a riot of color photos of shopping buddies with their senior partners, flyers for potlucks and dance classes, and at its heart, the faded newspaper clipping of Dorothy's story. "Look at this, Mrs. Washington," Tommy said, his chest puffing with pride as he handed her the store's new training manual. He'd been promoted to assistant manager after stepping up during the incident, and now the manual boasted a section called the Washington Protocolguidelines, rooted in dignity and respect for every soul who walked through the doors. Outside, in the parking lot, Reverend Thompson's church had parked a white van emblazoned with community unity. In bold blue letters, it shuttled elderly shoppers who couldn't drive, funded by donations that had flooded in after Dorothy's story went viral. She watched as Officer Murphy, another man reshaped by his mistake, helped an old man load his groceries, his hands steady and gentle where they'd once been quick to accuse. In the produce section, where it had all begun, a small garden now thrived. Local school kids knelt in the dirt, tending herbs and vegetables under Dorothy's watchful eye, their laughter echoing as they learned to nurture life. The food bank reaped the harvest, and Dorothy used the lessons to teach them about resilience and care. Mrs. Washington, a teenage girl, called out Lisa, Kevin's sister, who'd started a youth volunteer program after watching her brother defend Dorothy that fateful day. "Can you help us plan next week's senior dance? We're holding it in the community room after hours." That room, once a dusty storage space, had become the beating heart of the neighborhood. Dance classes, ESL lessons, police community forums, and youth projects spilled from its calendar. Its walls adorned with a mural of clasped hands encircling the words, "Stand like Washington." Maria's Community Guardians program had spread to stores citywide, and Dorothy found herself speaking at community centers, her voice steady as she recounted how a moment of injustice had birthed a movement. Even the police academy had shifted. New recruits now volunteered in the community before earning their badges, and Dorothy was a fixture at their training, her story a living lesson in the cost of power misused and the strength of justice reclaimed. As she looked out over the bustling store, her heart swelled not with pride, but with a quiet certainty that the ripples of one terrible day had become waves of change, washing over them all. Dorothy Washington stood amid the lively chaos of Carter's Market, her senses wrapped in the hum of a community reborn. The store thrummed with energy, shoppers weaving through aisles, the clatter of carts, and the soft murmur of voices blending into a comforting symphony. Her gaze settled on Officer Jensen, his broad shoulders hunched slightly as he knelt beside Mrs. Chen, a frail woman with silver hair and a trembling smile. Together, they sifted through a colorful array of cake decoration sprinkles, tiny sugar flowers, and shimmering edible pearls. Jensen's deep voice patient and kind as he offered suggestions. Dorothy's chest tightened, a swell of pride mingling with the ache of memory. Not far off, Sarah Chen, her stethoscope dangling like a badge of honor, leaned close to an elderly man seated near the pharmacy counter, her fingers pressed gently against his wrist, her brow furrowed in concentration as she checked his blood pressure, her quiet reassurances a balm to his anxious expression. Nearby, young Tommy, barely into his 20s, yet carrying the weight of responsibility with a grin, coached a nervous new employee through the steps of the Washington Protocol system he'd helped craft, a testament to lessons hard-earned. Dorothy's eyes shimmered with unshed tears, the sting of joy sharp and overwhelming. She could still feel the shadow of that terrible Tuesday morning, a day that had once threatened to break them all, yet here they were stronger, together, a tapestry of resilience woven from pain. A young mother approached, her stroller creaking softly as she maneuvered it through the crowd. Her face was bright with hope, though a flicker of uncertainty danced in her eyes. "My grandmother's moving here next month," she said, her voice tentative yet warm. "I've heard this is the safest place for elderly folks to shop. Is that true?" Dorothy turned to her, taking in the woman's earnest gaze, the way her hands gripped the stroller as if anchoring herself to this moment. A smile spread across Dorothy's face, slow and sure, as she glanced around at the bustling Sina Jensen's laughter mingling with Mrs. Chen's, Sarah's steady presence, Tommy's youthful determination. "It's more than safe," she replied, her voice rich with conviction. "It's home." The words carried the weight of everything they'd fought for, a promise forged in the crucible of that dark day 6 months ago, when chaos had erupted and justice had seemed a distant dream. Half a year had passed since the incident that shook Carter's Market to its core, and now Dorothy sat in the front row of City Hall's main chamber, the air thick with anticipation. The room buzzed with the rustle of bodies pressed close, the faint scent of polished wood and ink hanging heavy. She wore her favorite purple dress, its fabric soft against her skin, the same one she'd donned that fateful Tuesday. It felt like armor now, a quiet symbol of survival and defiance. Mayor Richardson stood at the podium, her posture rigid with purpose, her hands clutching a document that gleamed under the chamber's harsh lights. "Today," she declared, her voice cutting through the murmurs like a blade, "we signed the Dorothy Washington Community Protection Act." The words landed like a thunderclap, and Dorothy's breath caught as a ripple of applause surged through the crowd. This wasn't just a law, it was a vow etched in ink, a shield against the abuses of power that had once torn their city apart. It mandated community integration training for every officer, birthed civilian oversight committees in each district, and poured resources into support programs that stitched the community back together. Dorothy watched as council members stepped forward, their pens scratching across the page with deliberate strokes, sealing a future she'd never dared imagine. In the audience, Officers Jensen and Murphy sat side by side, their uniforms crisp, but their faces softened by a humility Dorothy hadn't seen in them before. Once enforcers of a broken system, they now led Project Washington, a training initiative that had already reshaped over 300 officers nationwide. Jensen had pulled her aside that morning, his voice thick with emotion, his eyes glistening as he spoke. "Mrs. Washington," he'd said, his hands fidgeting as if unaccustomed to vulnerability. "You didn't just teach us how to police, you showed us forgiveness. Growth." She'd seen the ghosts of that Tuesday in his gaze, the weight of batons swung to hard, of trust shattered. Now, he carried a different burden, the hope of redemption. Beside Dorothy, Sarah Chen radiated quiet strength, her role as chief resident dwarfed by her new mission. Her medical outreach had blossomed into a network of free clinics, tucked into grocery stores citywide, their fluorescent-lit corners offering care to the forgotten. Hundreds of elderly patient-stooped figures with weathered hands had found healing because of her, their gratitude a silent hymn that filled her days. Tommy, meanwhile, had risen fast, his boyish charm now tempered by the steely resolve of Carter's Market's youngest manager. That morning, he'd returned from addressing a national retail association, his voice still echoing with the Washington Protocol's promise, a blueprint for unity and accountability. Chains across the country were adopting it, inspired by a kid who'd once trembled under the glare of flashing lights and sirens. Dorothy's heart swelled as she overheard him joking with the new employee, his laughter a thread of light in the store's daily grind. Later, as cameras flashed and a reporter pressed a microphone toward her, Dorothy's voice was steady. "The real victory isn't in the law that carries my name," she said, her eyes sweeping the crowd. "It's in how our community found its spine. We learned that standing together, we can forge the change we crave." The lesson was clear: power unchecked breeds ruin, but justice, tempered by unity, builds something enduring. The Community Guardians program, sparked by that single, shattering day, now stretched across 50 cities. Maria Rodriguez, a weary woman with a fire in her step, crisscrossed the country to plant its seeds. Once a cashier who'd ducked behind her register as shouts rang out, she'd emerged a leader, her voice a clarion call for neighbors helping neighbors. Back at Carter's Market, The community room wall told their story in vivid strokes, a timeline of triumph. Photos captured the candlelight vigil's glow, flames flickering against tear-streaked faces. The first senior dance, where laughter had drowned out sorrow. Jensen ladling soup at the food bank, his apron smeared with gravy. Dorothy's grandson, Marcus, had poured his soul into a documentary, its frames unspooling the chaos of that Tuesday and the slow, stubborn rise that followed. It wasn't just a tale of what went wrong, it was a map of how they'd made it right. A film now flickering in police stations and community halls. Its awards a quiet nod to their truth. Reverend Thompson's church, once a sanctuary of stained glass and hymns, had transformed into a crucible for organizers. People flocked from distant states, their notebooks open, their hearts hungry to learn the Washington model, peaceful change through dignity, not division. Dorothy felt the weight of it all as she left City Hall that afternoon, the sun dipping low, casting long shadows across the steps. A gaggle of school children swarmed nearby, their teacher's voice rising above their chatter. One woman's dignity and a community's unity changed the city, she said, her tone reverent. The kids turned, wide-eyed, spotting Dorothy. A little girl with braids and a gap-toothed grin darted forward. "My grandma says you're a hero," she shouted, her voice piercing the air. Dorothy paused, her smile soft but firm. "The real heroes," she said, her gaze sweeping the faces around her, "are everyone who stood up that day and every day since it'll make us better. One person can spark a change, but it takes us all to keep it burning." That evening, Dorothy sank into her favorite chair, the cushions molding to her frame like an old friend. A scrapbook lay open on her lap, its pages a mosaic of the past 6 months. There was the shopping list from that Tuesday, now framed and mounted in the police academia, relic of ordinary courage. Photos spilled across the spreads, community picnics under sprawling oaks, newspaper headlines shouting their victories, letters from strangers whose lives had shifted in the wake of their fight. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting her living room in hues of gold and amber, Dorothy's thoughts drifted to the Tuesday mornings yet to come. They'd be different now, woven with friendship, dignity, and the unshakable warmth of a community that had learned to stand as one. Her simple errand had ignited a legacy, a lesson for generations. Justice isn't just a cry against power's misuse, it's the quiet, steady work of building something better, together, with grace.